Council Toolkit webinar. Woo-hoo! The unifying call draft of the Missouri Mid-South Conference, which is like our mission statement, states the following. We are the United Church of Christ in Arkansas, Memphis, and Missouri. United by Christ and led by the Holy Spirit, we support and empower one another in our unifying call to embody God's love and mercy for all. End quote. Today's webinar for all of our church councils is meant to support and empower you in your roles as the leaders of your church. We thank you that you have been called to embody God's love and justice for all in your particular community, as well as throughout God's creation. I am aware that being the church in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic and the pandemic of white supremacy has been challenging, to say the least. For that reason, I begin our time together by saying, thank you. Thank you for all that you have done for the church leading up to this moment. And thank you for saying yes to church leadership during these global pandemics. I truly believe that every one of you has been called by God for such a time as this because of your particular gifts of the Spirit, as Paul would say. Because your gifts of the Spirit are what God needs for your church and the beloved community to fully live into God's love. So thank you. Today's webinar is intended to strengthen your particular gifts as tools needed for your church council toolkit. So I share here a very old toolbox. When I graduated from college and was about to move off to seminary, my parents gave me this toolbox as a going away present for how to live on my own. I, of course, rolled my eyes a little bit and thought, when will I ever need this toolbox? And yet, I have used it often in the past 28 years. I didn't use all of the tools my first day living on my own, but I have reached in here at various times for a nail or a hammer or a leveler or a tape measure. This is our goal for today's webinar, to provide different tools for your church council toolkit. You may not use all of these tools today or tomorrow, but over the course of this next year, we pray that when you need a leveler to make sure things are balanced, you can pull out just the right tool. Or when you need a nail for the precision of your ministry, you can pull out just the right resources from our leaders. Please know at the beginning of today that everything that we say and present today will be available for all of you by Thursday in our e-courier as well as our website. So you don't have to take meticulous notes to capture everything unless that's the way that you learn and absorb information. I want to tell you about the structure of our day. In a few moments, we will begin with our first keynote of the day, led by the Reverend Mary Nelson, whom I will introduce in a moment. After a break, we will then have a 45-minute session with 2 workshop options. You don't need to go anywhere or push a button. We will use the breakout rooms in Zoom for our workshops. In a moment, we will prompt you to tell us in the chat what workshop you want to attend for each session. After the 10 a.m. workshop, we will have a quick stretch break and then return for a second workshop session. We will have a 30-minute lunch at Zoom at noon, You can turn off your video and go eat, go take a walk, or you can come get your lunch and come back and fellowship with your friends here in the Missouri Mid-South Conference in this main Zoom area. We won't turn Zoom off, so there's nothing you have to do during lunch. We will return for our final workshop session at 1 p.m. and then conclude with our final keynote session and closing worship and blessing of all of you as our church leaders. And then we will be done at 2 p.m. Woohoo! This is your webinar. If you need more breaks than what we've provided, go ahead and get up and do what you need to do. Just a little bit of housekeeping on Zoom. If you're not familiar with Zoom, at the bottom on the left side is where you can mute yourself. And if you are using video, if you need to step away, you can stop video and you're still there. Also, you'll see kind of going towards the right on that bottom bar on chat. We're going to be using chat a lot so that it's going to be interactive and engaging. So if you want to, at any time, both in the keynotes as well as in the workshops, if you want to ask a question, if you want to raise something, you can do that. Mike Cruson has already tried it out. And if there's somebody that you want to speak to directly, you can hit that person and it'll say private, and then you can send them a private message. Just make sure if you're doing that, that you're sending it directly to that person and not to the whole group. And then there's on the right side, a place of reactions. You know, if you want to do a thumbs up, or if you want to show clapping for something, you can use that in a fun way as well. I want to introduce our workshop options that we'll have and celebrate our conference staff who will be leading the workshops as well. Workshop number 1, which starts at 10 a.m., there's 2 options. The first one is Spiritual Tools for Weary Children and Youth. That's led by Cindy Berkner, who is our youth ministry coordinator, and Nate Falk, who is our executive director of Shannondale Outdoor Ministries. The second workshop option for 10 a.m., I will be leading on pastoral relations and/or personnel committees. Then workshop number 2 session, which starts at 11 a.m., the first option is Tools for Budgets and Stewardship During COVID. This will be led by our conference bookkeepers, Cora Willard and Renee Warner. And then the second option is Tools for Post-Pandemic Ministry, and that will be led by Damian Lake, our Associate Conference Minister. Then finally, the third workshop option session starts at 1 p.m. And those 2 workshop options are Technology Tools for Worship, Files, and Meetings. Jeremy Force, the Executive Director of Camp Moval, Kathy Rainey, our Office Manager, and Julie DeArnold Atkins, our Communications Specialist, will be co-leading that workshop. And then I will be leading a workshop on Tools for Church Council Moderators. You can join one of these. If you get into one and you think, oh, that's not really for me, just message me in the chat and we'll move you to the other one. And I encourage you to go ahead and put that in the chat so that we can set that up for our workshop time. I would be remiss if I did not begin our time together to acknowledge the obvious. Because of your church's generosity to our church's wider mission, also lovingly known as OCWM, woohoo! We are able to provide today's Church Council webinar to you. Thank you. We also have used money from our Strengthen the Church UCC offering in order to compensate our keynote speaker for her time, wisdom, and skills. Thank you, thank you, thank you for your financial generosity to OCWM and Strengthen the Church. Finally, I want to introduce my friend and our keynote speaker today, the Reverend Mary Nelson. Mary is completing her ministry tomorrow as the Associate Conference Minister in the Southern New England Conference. She has also served as a pastor of a local UCC church in Vermont. Mary grew up in Des Moines, Iowa, and graduated from the UCC school, Grinnell College, before receiving her MDiv from Candler School of Theology. I first met Mary when we served on the first UCC 2030 network, as we were both in our 20s and 30s a few years ago. Mary has a deep love for the local church and shares her wisdom tools for how our church councils can fully live into who God has created us to be through these global pandemics. Mary, on behalf of the Missouri Mid-South Conference, we welcome you as siblings in ministry together. Come and share your wisdom tools with us. Woohoo!
Ginny, thank you so much for that warm welcome. And it's a delight to be here this morning, all the way from Connecticut. This is the beauty and the joy of modern technology, and I am grateful that we can share in it together. I've been scrolling through, looking at your faces, and I'm just so excited to be introduced to a whole new part of the church that I haven't gotten to meet yet. So thank you for being here, and thank you for this time, and I hope that I can give to you a measure of what you have already given to me. So thank you. As Ginny said in my bio, I am from Iowa. I grew up at Plymouth Church in Des Moines. I was baptized, confirmed, and ordained there. And everything I know about church leadership, I learned first at home. My family's life revolved around the church, and my parents held nearly every lay leadership role possible. No one in my family has ever been clergy before. And when I got up the courage to tell my mother that I was thinking about majoring in religious studies in college, her response was, "Oh no, that's worse than art history." She was very relieved then when my next sentence was, "Well, but I'm thinking about becoming a pastor." Little did I know that my education about church leadership had really begun at the dinner table in my childhood. My dad chaired the senior pastor search committee the year I was in confirmation. My mom served on the board of deacons throughout my time in high school. I was asked to serve on the hymnal search committee and the peace committee when I was in 11th grade. And I'd started singing in the children's choirs when I was 5 years old. I still join the adult choir when I'm home to visit. An important thing to know about the experience of singing in the children's choir is this. When the children's choir is done singing, before the kids in the sanctuary are dismissed to go to Sunday school, the pastor transitions that moment of the service by saying, "Choir, thank you for your leadership in worship today." Naming the leadership of children is a really great way to help them see themselves as leaders, and to help the grown-ups in the church understand the children as leaders too. As Jeannie said, I went to seminary in Georgia at a Methodist school because all I knew was the UCC in the Midwest, and I needed to expand my experience base. And then I was called to serve a church in Vermont as their solo pastor at 3/4 time. While I was there, the 2030 Clergy Network found me, and Ginny and I overlapped on that leadership team for 1 year, as she mentioned. And then I became the first treasurer of the network. And this is a case of accidentally falling into an opportunity that becomes life-changing. I became the treasurer because we had decided to sell t-shirts at Synod. And I was the person on the planning call who thought to ask, what do we do with the money when Synod is over? And what happens if somebody wants to write a check? Do we have a bank account? And that is how I found myself flying home from Synod with $1,000 in cash and several hundred more in checks, tucked carefully into my purse to deposit them in my local bank in Burlington the next day. I went on to spend the following 3 years fundraising for the network, managing their money, and being the person who paid the bill at the end of the networking events we planned for the next Synod. That led to a side ministry in stewardship education across the Vermont Conference, and eventually to serving as an associate conference minister in Connecticut for the last 7 years. I've worked with churches in Connecticut and consulted for conferences across the UCC, and I still draw on the leadership education I first received at home in Iowa. It was watching my parents serve as dedicated lay leaders and then being invited into leadership myself that gave me the foundation for leadership education that I have today. Good leaders care about being good leaders. So thank you for being here today, because you are a part of that education as well. So now that I've introduced myself a little bit more, I'd like to take a little time to get to know who you are. Jeannie said we've got a little over 100 people signed up for this day, which is exciting. And I'm sure some of you know one another and some of you don't. There's no way we can do individual introductions, but we're going to use Zoom's polling technology to get a sense of the wisdom and experience that you collectively bring into this room. So Kathleen, if you are ready with the first poll, and you can pop that up here. It should come up on your screen in just a second. I am a lifelong UCCer, as I said, and I'm wondering who you are and what your experience is. So we'll give a moment or two for you to read all these options and answer.
And Mary, it may kind of do all of them.
Yeah, it looks like it's doing all of them at once, which is fine. And when you've filled out all 4 questions, you can hit the submit button.
Oh, gee.
It's a lot to take in, I know. Maybe about 10 more seconds. It's hard to gauge how much time people need to look this through.
Of about 75% who have finished.
Okay, great.
%. Anyone else? We're going to close it in just a second. Okay, Mary, I'll go. Is it okay if I close it now?
Yeah,
Okay.
please. Oh, this is exciting. Okay, so many lifelong UCCers, but we're not exclusively lifelong UCC. We've got a great variety of different roles that are present today, but most folks are council member at large, but a good smattering of others as well. a variety of experience levels in terms of how long you've been in the role that you're in, but slight majority of folks who've been in the role for a few years. And you're here because you want to learn new things. And you're here. Not all of you checked this. I expected 100% participation, but you're all here because you love your church. You wouldn't give up your Saturday if you didn't love your church. This is helpful to me. Thank you to know who's here. And now you've all gotten experience with the polling option on Zoom, so that's fun too. So as we're thinking this morning and throughout the day about your 2021 toolkit for church council, I want us to start with the general understanding that church council work is a leadership position. So in case nobody's ever told you before, you are a leader. By virtue of being elected to the position, by virtue of doing the work the church council does, by virtue of being here this morning and wanting to add to your toolkit, you are a leader. Thank you for your leadership. Moving into this next moment, I want to share with you a story about leadership. And I'm going to talk more about the tasks of leadership this afternoon. So for now, I'd like to encourage you to listen to the story and think about what you hear in terms of the roles of various leaders in the story. And this is a true story, but I want to invite you to think of it as a parable about church leadership in the 21st century. Listen for the roles of the leaders and what you might learn and apply now in your churches in a parable on church leadership.
Good morning. I'm sorry I joined late. This is Vera.
Welcome.
I'm sorry I joined late, but I'm not at my home. So good morning.
That's all right, Vera. Thank you.
Okay.
So listen for this story, for the roles of the leaders and what you might learn and apply now in your churches. When the 2020 coronavirus pandemic started, a pastor I know looked back through his church's archives to glean what his predecessors had done when the 1918 flu pandemic started. He learned that the church had turned to the telephone, the flashy new technology of the day, in order to stay connected. A telephone was installed in the parish house offices and another in the parsonage, and members began to have telephones installed in their homes as well. And when they could not be together physically, those ancestors found other ways to conduct church business and maintain their sense of community. So in 2020, when the pastor and moderator of the church realized that one of their history-bearing council members was unable to access the video conferencing technology they were using, they contacted the treasurer and identified some discretionary funds, bought him an iPad, installed Zoom on it, brought it to him with a little plug-in Wi-Fi hotspot, and taught him how to use it. Take a moment, think to yourself, write it down if it helps. You can put it in the chat if you'd like. Who were the players in this story and what were their roles? I'm not seeing things pop up in the chat quickly, so I'll just do a quick show of hands. You can use the reaction button. Oh, things are starting to come into the chat. Okay. Who heard the role of pastor? A lot of folks. And the pastor functioned as a storyteller, as a, now they're coming in, as an innovator. I love that. A meaning maker, a partner in ministry. pastor and moderator. Somebody got the moderator. The moderator was also a partner in ministry, and I would say somebody who enacted the work of the church. There was also the members back in 1918 contributed. Exactly. Thank you, Joy. The ancestors of the church. Tradition was a partner in this story as well. I mentioned very briefly the current moderator, who I consider to be a waymaker or an enabler, someone who helped to figure out the resources that they needed. And there was the current council member who was the lost sheep. He was a learner in this situation and also a partner in ministry. So I'm going to read the story again and listen this time to identify some themes or ideas that arise for you around leadership. As you listen, what does leadership look like here? When the 2020 coronavirus pandemic started, a pastor I know looked back through his church's archives to glean what his predecessors had done when the 1918 flu pandemic started. He learned that the church had turned to the telephone, the flashy new technology of the day, in order to stay connected. A telephone was installed in the parish house offices and another in the parsonage, and members began to have telephones installed in their homes as well. When they could not be together physically, those ancestors found other ways to conduct church business and maintain their sense of community. And so in 2020, when the pastor and moderator of the church realized that one of their history-bearing council members was unable to access video conferencing technology, they contacted the treasurer and identified some discretionary funds, bought him an iPad, installed Zoom on it, brought it to him with a little plug-in Wi-Fi hotspot, and taught him how to use it. I see a few things are already popping up in the chat. What were themes of leadership that you saw at play in the story? What do you think leadership looks like? And I know we haven't really talked about leadership yet. We'll do more of that this afternoon, but give it a try. Consulting the past for ideas. Yes. We call that retraditioning, claiming what is useful from our past and bringing it forward, reinterpreted for present day needs. Action, embracing new technology, even when it's challenging. Research, maintaining community, empathy. Oh, I love this. There's so much happening. Taking initiative, embracing change, working together, seeing a need and filling it. Generosity, absolutely. Oh, this is great. Thank you all. Innovation, creativity and problem solving, resilience, financial expenditure. Sometimes you have to spend money to fix a problem. Delegation of tasks, John, yes. Communication, teaching, education. They didn't just give him the iPad and say, you figure it out. They made sure he knew how to use the tool. Treasurer who knows which fund to use, absolutely. So you can see there's a lot going on here in this story. Leadership is a lot of different activities at the same time. Chapter 13 of the letter to the Hebrews urges its hearer to remember your leaders, those who spoke the word of God to you. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. It then goes on to read, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Do not be carried away by all kinds of strange teachings, for it is well for the heart to be strengthened by grace, not by regulations about daily matters which have not benefited those who observe them. The author continues a little later, do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls and will give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with sighing, for that would be harmful to you. And I left in that last little bit just to provoke a little chuckle. Don't make the leader's job harder than it has to be, because that could blow back on you. But remember your leaders. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. Leadership in the church is about a way of life, and it's demonstrated in the outcomes of that way of life. Often when we hear the words of scripture, particularly direct guidance like this, we receive it as a passive audience. Okay, remember the leaders, consider the outcome of their way of life. Okay, so let me speak really plainly here. You are here today because you are those leaders that your churches are looking to. It's not some hypothetical other's way of life. It's not the pastor's way of life and nobody else's. You are the leaders whose way of life matters right now. That's why you're here. Because you are leaders, and the outcome of your way of life will tell your fellow church members whether or not they should follow you. Deep breath. We'll come back to that later this afternoon. In our dry bylaws speak terminology, we often hear the church council described as the executive body responsible for the work of the church in that time period between congregational meetings. And most of the time, nobody really knows what this means because it's so broad and undefined. The way most of our church councils actually function is often as a reporting body. The different boards and committees of the church send a representative to council who reports on the board's activities. This makes for deadly boring meetings. The kind where you spend an hour and a half sitting there thinking, this could have been an email, and I could be home watching the news hour and drinking a glass of wine. Not that any of us have ever had that thought. More often than not, most members of the congregation and many members of the council itself are hard-pressed to say what the council is supposed to do. So I'm glad you're here today because it's our hope to be able to change that. The church council is the governing body that empowers the ministry of the church. Let me say that again. The church council is the governing body that empowers the ministry of the church. We are a people who cherish the idea of the priesthood of all believers. All of us are ministers, individually and collectively, and our congregational polity means that the congregation makes its own decisions. But the church council is the governing body that empowers the ministry of the church. The church council is responsible for the big picture work of governance, for vision casting, for goal setting, for forward movement, for decision-making process, for oversight and accountability. The church council establishes policy that empowers people to do the church's work. From there, they delegate individual tasks of ministry to staff and to volunteers. They make sure that the resources exist to do those ministry tasks. When it comes to the work of individual council members, officers, board chairs, pastor, etc., and really this goes for anybody in a leadership position in the church, I have just one key rule. Know what your job is and do it. The corollary to this is don't do what is not your job. That's the first thing you should put in your 2021 Church Council Toolkit. I developed this rule when I realized that about 85% of the church conflicts I was called in to mediate had at their core some kind of turf battle about who was or wasn't doing whose job and who thought it was their job to supervise and probably to criticize how that job was or wasn't getting done. If there is a lack of clarity about roles, address it. If there is a lack of resources needed to do the job, assess and revise accordingly. If there is a lack of communication, figure out where the gaps are and fill them. If there is a personality conflict, educate and work on the relationship. But above all, know what your job is and do it. Do not do what is not your job. That is part of why I like this second part of the Hebrews passage, and I included it today for our thinking. Do not be carried away by all kinds of strange teachings, for it is well for the heart to be strengthened by grace, not by regulations about daily matters, which have not benefited those who observe them. Council's focus is the big picture of the church, and the details are for the people who are doing the ministry work to figure out. Don't get carried away with other things that are not your job. Don't get caught up in dealing with small rules that aren't relevant to the work you need to do. Know what your job is and do it. Do not do what is not your job. When we talk about what should be in your 2021 Church Council Toolkit, the second thing I'd lift up is this. Nominating members to the Church Council is one of the most important decisions a current leader can make about the future of the church. Your greatest resource on your Church Council, and again with any leadership position in the church, is the people who are elected to serve in their roles. We may think of words like trust and credibility when we think about qualifications for leadership, and those qualities are important, it's true. But if we stop there, we end up nominating the same known people to the same leadership positions again and again. And that's not actually good for the church in the long term. You want to have a balance of established leaders and new voices. So the key qualification for council service is that the members you nominate to leadership positions must be people of goodwill. When we talk about people of goodwill, we mean people who are capable of putting the church's needs above their own personal preferences and desires for the church. Nominating to a pastoral search committee is a great example of this. You need people who can put aside their own ideas about what they like and don't like in a pastor, and who can instead focus on the pastoral needs of the church as it grows into the next stage of its life. Church council leadership especially must be able to make this same distinction about church governance. We have to be able to remember that the church doesn't exist to make individual members happy. The church exists to do ministry. We can get tripped up then when we populate our council with whoever is each committee's chair this year, because we get confused about what our jobs are as leaders. When we nominate someone to the church council because they are a board chair, that creates the impression that they are at the table in order to represent that board's interests. That's what makes a church council devolve into a reporting body instead of a governing body. That's what can make budget and visioning meetings feel like council members are competing with one another for scarce resources. When members of a church council think that they have been convened in order to represent factional interests, that ends up creating factions in the church. In fact, council leadership needs to be understood the other way around. The council members think that they have been convened. No, the council members must represent the interests of the church on behalf of the council to the board to which they are assigned. A council member's responsibility is to the church as a whole, not to a particular group within the church. The third item that I would suggest for your 2020 church toolkit is flexibility. We have just been through and are still in the midst of a huge shock to our systems. We have spent decades, generations, doing church the way we've always done it. And all that has been upended. But except in very rare cases, we have not actually addressed the long-term challenges to policy and governance that the coronavirus pandemic has set before us. Not yet, anyway. We have mostly been in crisis mode. And in crisis mode, we operate with a lot of provisional measures. We need leaders who are confident in what they're doing, but who are not so bound up in the old ways that they can't be effective in this unfolding future. We're going to talk about leadership specific to pandemic life this afternoon. So I think that this is a good time to stop and take questions, if there are any. Please feel free to put them in the chat. It's probably the best way that everyone can have their question addressed.
Mary, there's a question about personality conflicts and that you need to deal with them. Will we discuss tips for that?
Oh, you know, I hadn't planned on it later this afternoon, but that is a good question. Personality conflicts can end up really sucking the air out of the room, really end up consuming all the energy of a church, and then you don't get any ministry done. So tips for personality conflicts, I think, are number one is listening, and actually getting the two people or group of people who are having a conflict to sit down together and listen to one another. Because with listening can come more understanding and closer relationship. I think that the more you can do to try to bring those people together into relationship with one another, the more the personality conflicts can be addressed, because there's more understanding, there's more communication. They might understand one another's motivations and perspectives more effectively. And then that helps to mitigate the conflict and make it go away.
Another question. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, please
Mary.
go ahead, Jenny.
Rob Van S asks, can you speak more to how to best recruit new council members?
Invite them. People are more likely to say yes to a task if you invite them specifically, and if you tell them why you think they would be good for it. So if your current practice is to stand up in December and say, hey, everybody, we've got annual meeting coming in January, we need to nominate folks for the committees, you're going to just get the same people recycling onto the committees. But if you sit down as a committee, as a nominating committee, or even as, you know, if a board or a committee is self-nominating, if you sit down and think, who's not at the table? Whose voice do we need? Who's got gifts that we don't have yet? Who's got skills or experiences that might be valuable here in this room? And then you actively seek out those people and say, hey, Mary, you would be great on church council. You've got a really valuable perspective, and you've got a really valuable set of skills. Will you please join our church council? Mary is more likely to say yes than if you were just asking generally for volunteers.
A couple of other questions. We've got a couple related to bylaws.
Mm-hmm.
One being, we struggle with doing a comprehensive review of the bylaws. Is there a model for doing this? And then another one, when bylaws call for committee members to be on council, how can that be adapted?
Those are great questions, and they're related. Bylaws are supposed to be hard to change. But what often happens, and I think what has happened in many of our churches, is that we've confused the purpose of bylaws and the purpose of other policies that don't necessarily belong in the bylaws. And we have thrown everything into the bylaws, and then they're really hard to change. So when you're talking about needing to do a review of the bylaws, I think the first thing you need to ask yourselves is, does this section actually belong in the bylaws? Or does this need to be a separate policy that is upheld, written, adapted, maintained by the board or committee that enacts this particular ministry that this section is about? Bylaws don't need to be long. They don't need to be cumbersome. They don't need to be scary. They are governing documents that the law requires that have specific elements in them. They have to name the organization. They have to say how somebody becomes a member. They have to say how somebody becomes elected to a leadership position. They have to say how decisions are made in the big picture. But they don't have to describe the way the deacons dress on Sunday morning. They don't have to describe which silver is used for communion on which special holiday. We don't have to get into those sorts of nitty-gritty details in bylaws. So the number one question is, does this need to be in bylaws, or is this something else? It's some other kind of policy. And then when bylaws call for committee members to be on council, that's okay. You can change that if you want, you don't have to. But it's important to remember when you are on church council and a member of another committee that your first task is to attend to the work of the church overall. And you are a conduit for that work to the committee that you have been asked to serve. It's not the other way around. You're not representing that one committee's interests to council. You're representing the church's interests to that committee.
If there is an interest in bylaw conversation, I can certainly create a meeting or webinar at another time with our conference attorney, and invite folks from churches regarding this, because I think this is a very critical time related to healthy, efficient bylaws that really reflects our churches. The other question, Mary, Polly McWilliams says, if you're on council and you're asked to be a council rep to a ministry, do you think that's good?
Yeah. I think that being a council representative to a ministry can improve relationships, can improve communication in the church. The more points of contact the council has with various ministries in the church, the better. The question then becomes, what's your role in that committee? Is it a communication function? Is it an oversight function? Do you sort of automatically become the chair and set the agenda for that committee? What is the expectation of a council rep to a committee? And that is determined by an individual congregation and how they want to govern themselves. It's something that you should be discussing regularly to make sure that everybody's on the same page and shares an understanding of what roles are. Marcy asks, how do you differentiate the council representing the whole church versus individuals seeing themselves in the mission of the church? I think one answer to that question is to recognize the difference between governance and ministry. The governance function of the church council is to set policy, to set goals, to keep an understanding of the big picture and empower people to do the ministry on the ground. So people can be a part of both. It's not like there's only governance over here and there's only ministry over there. Ideally everyone is connected to the mission of the church, and some people are tasked with the work of governance for right now. But maintaining the distinction between what is governance and what is ministry then helps people see where they fit into both.
And just so that you know, I'll be showing a brief video in the moderators workshop by Dan Hotchkiss, who's kind of the guru of governance and ministry, who talks about that and those roles from that perspective. I want to lift up, Donna has a great awareness that choosing council members assumes enough members to choose from. Small churches often do not have this luxury. Mary, do you have any wisdom from that perspective?
Yes, I think, and this is something I've seen a lot lately. A lot of churches are making their councils smaller, making their committees smaller. That's a bylaws change usually. But there is no hard and fast rule that says you must have 12 people on the church council. That often is a tradition that comes from the biblical understanding of who Jesus's inner circle was. It's an arbitrary number. There's no rule that says that council has to be some certain percentage of the members of the church. That's usually a quorum. Council doesn't have to be giant, but council has to be well connected. And I would say that the smaller you make your church council, the more intentional you need to be about making sure that there's a diverse group of people in that small group. Folks who have been members of the church for a long time and folks who are relatively new, folks who are different ages, involved in different ways in church life, folks who've been involved in many things, folks who've focused on one thing their whole time in the church. Getting diversity among the members of the council becomes more and more important the fewer numbers you have on council.
I think that's really healthy wisdom. I know the conference council, which is our board of directors, we've been wrestling with the healthy number of our board. It currently is 24, and we are proposing a revision to go to 18. Our conference attorney said that 18 was more in line with a nonprofit organization of our size. So I say that to say, if your church is smaller and you have 12 or 18 on there, that might be an opportunity to think about reducing that number.
There's also no hard and fast rule about how long a term of service should be. I generally see a lot of churches who have, 2-3 year terms. And so somebody is sort of de facto signing up for 6 years of serving on one board or committee. And that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Term limits are important. They are very important for the health of the church. But 1 4-year term is also a good way to approach making sure that you've got people rotating in and off of the committee and not burning out, for example. There are a lot of different ways to set that up as well. If there are other folks who have questions, continue to put them in the chat. I will be happy to get back to you later through Ginny. But I believe that our time is up for this morning session, and it's time for us to take our first little stretch break.
So I'm gonna, so thank you, Mary. This is really good in terms of starting us off. I'm gonna invite y'all to take a break, and we are fastidiously trying to create breakout rooms and put people in. So if you want to come back, our schedule says 10 after 10 is when we'll start our first workshop. So let's start then, and y'all enjoy your break, and we'll come back in just a few minutes.
Jenny,
Yes.
I have a question. I've got a message down here, but this is a stupid question. How do I send it?
Usually you just enter. So once you, but if you want to tell me, I'll put you in.
Okay, well, it's workshop number 1. I want to go with the
Pastor Relations.
Healthy pastoral relation. Yeah,
Perfect.
and then I might as well give you the other 2 now because I don't know how to send this darn thing.
Okay.
The tools for a post-pandemic ministry,
Okay.
and then technology tools for worship files and meetings.
Okay. Worship. Okay. All right. I will put that in.
This drives me nuts, though. I should be, I'm not stupid, but I can't figure out how to send these darn messages.
You should, once you type it, you should just be able to hit enter, and it shows.
Well, that's what I would think too, but it doesn't show that. All it shows off to the side is file, and then save and chat.
Oh my, I don't know what to tell you. I'm sorry.
Hi, this is Marcy. Can you just hit the enter button on your keyboard? That's what I do.
Oh,
Turn button. Yep.
my goodness. Why didn't I think of that? Okay, let me find
I
it.
did the same thing. I searched for that button on the screen and then I hit the enter on my keyboard and mine sent.
Oh my gosh. Let me find it. Now I got to find enter. I've got my wife's Mac, and I don't have a Mac. I have a PC, so I got to find enter on it.
It should be return. It could be the word return as well. I'm on a Mac.
Oh. There it is. You're wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
The conflict has risen to the point of about to push the pastor off the cliff, going from the story of Jesus in his hometown. Then the Pastor Relations Committee is called in. And what I want to say to you is that is not healthy. Pastor relations should be the advocates supporting the goodness of the pastor's ministry, as well as appropriately sharing the concerns and working through them for the health and wholeness of the pastor. Two functions of a pastor relations committee. Number one is to serve as an advisory group to the pastor. So this group shares ideas, dreams, and the pastor shares maybe some outside of the box thinking that the pastor is doing, and dreams and expectations about the congregation and where they're going. But also, the pastor relations committee should serve as a support group, interpreting roles, functions, and opportunities and needs of the pastor and the congregation. The goal of the pastor relations committee is to encourage a healthy, shared communication and responsibility, shared ministry between the pastor and your church. In order to do that, there has to be confidentiality, and the confidentiality of which I'm speaking is about what the pastor shares with this body. In order to be healthy, the pastor has to have a place to where the pastor can trust to be able to share, and it not either be shared in the parking lot, gossip conversations, or in other capacities, as well as, you know, what is shared in confidentiality. If there are concerns, it doesn't need to be broadcast everywhere. But I would also very quickly say that the pastor relations committee should not be the triangle between upset church members or church council members and the pastor. And I'll come back to that in a second. So the difference between a pastor relations committee and a personnel committee. Ideally, your church would have two separate committees. The personnel committee handles all of the human resource matters, such as personnel policies or a handbook for the employees, performing the evaluation of the pastor, as well as receiving from the pastor the evaluations and performance review of the staff that the pastor is the supervisor of, and recommending compensation increases for the staff and the pastor. That's the personnel committee. In the corporate world, the personnel committee functions like the human resource department. The pastor relations committee provides the support specifically to the pastor. Some churches have that it's both for the pastor and the associate pastor, but there again, being aware that the pastor is the supervisor of all of the staff, including the associate pastor, but it may be that the associate pastor also needs that support and advisory group as well. So ideally, as I said, this would be two committees, and there is distinction between them that is important for the clarity of the roles and responsibilities of these two very different responsibilities. Having said that, I'm aware that many of our churches aren't large enough to have two committees. And so your church may be one where you need to have a pastor relations / personnel committee. If that is the case in your church, I want to quote Brene Brown, who says, "Clear is kind, unclear is unkind." Meaning, if your pastor relations personnel committee needs to do human resource functions, then you need to be clear and state that.
if your committee is meeting with the pastor in an advisory or support role, i.e. the pastor relations committee, then y'all need to be clear in defining that. Because if the pastor is thinking that they are meeting with you as the pastor relations committee, but really you're functioning for that meeting as the personnel committee where you are talking about evaluation, there's going to be some miscommunication and potential for tension. So if ideally, if you have one committee, you would do the work of the human resource or the personnel committee in one meeting and the work of the pastor relations in another. Again, I'm not encouraging you to do lots of meetings. If you need to have one designated meeting, then be clear in what roles are being played there. I'm going to pause there for a moment because I want to make sure that you have time to kind of process all of what I've just said. So are there any questions of what I've shared so far from that perspective? Yes, Rita.
Yeah, we're lucky enough to have two committees. But when you said the pastor, and I know overall, pastor is the supervisor of all employees, staff. We also have a building manager, so he is over the custodian. So is there any lack of clarity about that with, like two supervisors or what?
So I would defer to your church's bylaws and everything, but usually the pastor is the supervisor of the staff. Now, if you've got something that's unique, as long as the staff are clear as to who the supervisor is, if you have somebody who's the supervisor of the custodian, I'm assuming that that supervisor is being supervised by the pastor. So, if that's the case, then, there has to be kind of a chain of command regarding who's doing what. And the pastor is the one who is supervised essentially by the church council, but usually that's given the responsibility to the personnel committee.
Thanks.
Marcy, I see that your hand is raised.
Yes, thank you. At our church, St. John UCC St. Clair, we just have one committee. If we were to have two, does the pastor participate in the personnel committee where they're there with the pastoral relations? How do you split that out?
So that's a great question, Marcy. And what I would say is the pastor needs to be involved, probably like other committees. On the personnel committee has voice but no vote. The pastor needs to have, the input regarding the policies, as well as evaluations from the personnel committee. It makes it difficult to do those two separate distinctions. Does that answer, Marcy?
It does help in our case, and we love Laura, by the way, but in our case, our only personnel is our minister. And so, is it really, if you are talking about the personnel, there has to be a fine line between your executive committee versus things that don't require that, right? So it becomes a little awkward.
That's right. And in some churches, what I'm describing as the personnel responsibilities may be the executive committee for the very reason of, your staff may be the pastor, and that's completely acceptable and understandable as well.
Thank you.
Great question. Yeah. So I'm gonna share screen again, and let's see, and keep on going. Okay. Oops. So I am a strong advocate. Whoops. Wait just a second, sorry. I am a strong advocate for monthly meetings with, and I'm just going to say the Pastoral Relations Committee at this point, because the work and the ministry that the Pastoral Relations Committee needs to do, it needs to be ongoing. Normally, my experience is that when I, as the conference minister or the committee on ministry, is called in with a church because there's conflict with the pastor, my first question, just so that you'll know, that I ask is, do you have a functioning pastoral relations committee? And often I'll hear people say, well, yes, but we really don't meet. That's where I would encourage you, get in the habit of meeting each month, even if you don't think you have anything to talk about. And I'm going to say, go one step further and say, especially during COVID-19, your pastor has led you through immense change, and your pastor is experiencing layers of change, anxiety, trauma, and stress. And your pastor needs to have a healthy outlet that is appropriate to process this with you in order to continue ministering through COVID. This is very important because a part of, I think, what's happening in some of our churches is people's anxiety about not being able to worship in person, having to wear a mask, just life in general. Some of those churches and members are projecting their fear onto their pastor. And when the pastor has had enough sleep and rest, then they're able to process well. And I would say when the pastor is able to process with a healthy body appropriately, they're not going to lash out in a way that causes more conflict. So here is an agenda. And again, all of this I'm going to send to you, and all of this is in a Sure Foundation by the UCC. An agenda for a monthly pastor relations meeting with the pastor. Opening prayer, personal check-ins, a recommitment to your relationship as pastor relations and pastor. And that might just be to say, we support you and we meet because we want a healthy church, which we know requires a healthy pastor. And then some potential questions. And this can be where you just let the conversation go as it needs to go. And let these be positives and not just negatives. Where did you feel most alive in your ministry this month? What part of ministry drained you the most this month? What biblical story has been your companion this month? What is one thing you have done as an act of radical self-care? What does support from the Pastor Relations Committee look like for you this month? And then another option for an agenda item is, we're swimming in the water of the details. Sometimes it's good to get out of the water and up to the kind of cliff perspective to look at where are we going? How do you see what's going on working in the bigger picture of our church's ministry? And then you would close with prayer. Again, I want to stress that the Pastor Relations Committee needs to focus on the positive and not just the negative. And when I was local church pastor, my Pastor Relations Committee was really good, and they saw this as their goal to develop this and communicate this with the congregation so that people did not just come to them with complaints about me. So here are some ways that I would suggest that you, as pastor relations, support your pastor. Number one, invite church members to write notes, handwritten notes, emails, and randomly send them to your pastor. I can't tell you how important those notes are. I get those notes as conference minister, and in St. Louis, in my conference office, in my desk drawer, I print them and put them in my desk drawer so that when I'm having an especially tough day, I can pull those notes out and balance whatever's going on with something that says, we believe in you and we support you. That goes a long way for your ministers. Number two, invite your minister to take a Sunday off from worship. Preaching is important, but so many of our pastors are having to do the technology and do other pieces of it, that still requires a lot of work. So I would encourage you, to have the conversation with the pastor and say, we want to give you a Sunday off. And then let them take that Sunday, not that they're eating bonbons and they're, maybe they are, but what's really happening is, number one, you're giving them the space to rest. And just like Jesus needed rest when he would go to the wilderness, so do our pastors. The next piece that I am strongly encouraging is encourage your pastor to take their vacation and continuing education days. At the beginning of the pandemic last year, I heard ministers saying, I can't go anywhere, so there's no use in me taking vacation. That is the quickest sign and movement to burnout. Make sure they're taking all of their vacation. Make sure, and maybe this is one of your reflection questions, what continuing education days will you be taking in the next 3 months? Because that also encourages them to renew and refresh themselves and come back with that energy. And then, of course, don't forget that October is Clergy Appreciation Month. When I was local pastor, Douglas Anders was my conference minister, and he was a member of my church. Every October, I had a note from him. He would send me a gift, and he made me feel appreciated. And that goes a long way. And I want to say that the Pastor Relations Committee is responsible for handling criticism and critique of the pastor. And there's 4 pieces of this I want to be very clear about. The first one is always encourage direct communication with the pastor. Number 2, have the person who has the concern write the concerns with their name and write it, submit it in writing. Number 3, address it fairly in the pastoral relations meeting. And then number 4, receive individual concerns and not petitions or groups of people. So first, encourage direct communication with the pastor. Always, that is important for the member to go directly to the pastor, because what this does is it avoids what we call triangulation. If member John Doe really doesn't like how the pastor is preaching, it's a whole lot easier to go to a pastor relations committee member and say, I really do not like the pastor's preaching. And then it would seem that the impetus is not off, is off of the member and now on the pastor relations. That is not healthy. Healthy conflict is when the person who does it, or the person who has the concern, goes directly to the pastor. If there is concern about doing that directly, that's when I would encourage the pastor relations committee to be willing to have someone present in the room. Your role is not to advocate one way or the other, but simply to be that safe space for the person. If they have already spoken to the pastor, and they come back to you, I would encourage them to continue talking directly to the pastor. If the pastor can't or won't speak to the pastor and the issue seems important, then move to step 2, which is have the person write the concern with their name and send it in. As I said, avoid anonymous communications. If they decline, then tell them that you will not receive anonymous concerns. And once they submit that, then you respond with a written acknowledgement. We have received your concern and will discuss it at our next meeting. And then at the next Pastoral Relations Committee meeting, that is one of the agenda items. It is not the only agenda item, it is one of. In that part of the meeting, you read the concern, and then you, with the pastor, decide if the concern has merit and needs more attention, or if the concern does not have merit and requires no further action. This is really important because this gives this process of potential conflict. This is healthy in terms of, what is it that we can learn? How can we grow? And I would say, just because somebody writes it, does not mean that that person's concern is going to automatically be changed and now the pastor is going to do exactly what the member wanted the pastor to do. There has to be appropriate and healthy discernment. If the pastoral relations finds the concern, yeah, I've done that. I defer to the UCC Sure Foundation. They focus on this in talking about it's important to receive individual concerns and not to do petitions or groups of people. If the Pastoral Relations Committee sees that that is a need, then there is a way to process that appropriately. And what the UCC says is not in a poll and not in a survey, which sometimes happens. There are healthy ways of, if there are groups of people who have concerns, there are healthy ways of addressing their concerns in that way. In the moments when there are large issues of conflict, I encourage you to reach out to your committee on ministry or myself or Damian Lake as Associate Conference Minister. We are here to support you and help to process that conflict in a healthy way to resolve it. The other piece that I will say is the Manual Ministry offers what's called a situational support consultation. These are really helpful for these kind of issues that have started to arise, not to the point where it's a just really volatile and ugly conflict, but where it would be helpful to have a facilitator facilitate the conversation. I strongly encourage you, if you get to that point, to consider situational support consultations. It is not punitive at all in terms of what is offered. I'm going to pause there because that's a whole lot of information, and invite any questions. I am aware that we are close to time in breaking up, but for a break. But is there anything else that you want to make sure that you ask or have a question about? Yes, Jane.
I just wanted you to clarify when you have a member submitting their written concern and their name to the committee because they're unwilling to go directly to the pastor. I'm taking it that should not be with any assumption that their name would not be shared, because then that would invalidate the whole reason for being transparent and forthright.
That's right. I want to say again that the person, number one, needs to go to the pastor,
Right.
and number two, it needs to have the person's name on it. That's the only way that true resolution of conflict can happen, if there's direct or in a written setting, if we know who those are concerned. When there's anonymous stuff that goes on, that just it becomes very toxic. Does that help, Jane?
Yeah, I mean, I assume that, but I wanted you to clarify it, because I thought maybe some people would think, oh, the person can give their concern to the committee and not have their name be known to the pastor that way. And I don't think that's healthy either.
I believe that if it is written with a name, it avoids gossip. And gossip seems to be the worst problem that we're having. If you can say it out loud and you can say it to the person and put your name to it, you're not going to embellish and you're not going to tell stories, nor is it going to go through the community.
That's right.
Jenny, we didn't have a pastoral relations committee until about 3 years ago. And the church council felt members of the church council should be on that pastoral relations committee. So we've worked away from that, except when our pastor came a few years ago, members on the search committee were there, part of it, to transition. But we're a small church and some of those members are also on the church council. So it's kind of a sticky wicket sometimes, but now we're no one who is on the church council is a member of that. But it's choosing in a small church, as we have few people, to work with that are willing to do some of the work. It was a change, but convincing them that there is a difference between pastoral relations and the work of the council was our biggest challenge.
I think that's one of the important parts, is determining who's going to be on the pastoral relations committee. In my previous church, it was at least one of them was the previous moderator of the church council, because they knew me really well and they knew the congregation. It was I think 3 or 4 people. One was someone who the pastor chose. One was someone that the church council chose, and then the previous church council moderator. It certainly needs to be somebody who has the credibility and the respect of the congregation and of the pastor. Okay, so we are at our stopping point. Thank you very much. And we're going to take a break and come back here, and then we'll give you the what to do next for your next workshop. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh my.
Just a reminder to folks that we are on a break until 11-ish. So if you need a few moments to step away, grab an extra cup of coffee or a big giant heaping glass of water, feel free to take a moment and find that and join us back here at 11. Well, good morning. Hopefully you all have some good energy left to get us through the rest of our morning before we get to a lunch break. I just want to remind you, if you are in this Zoom space, you are with me, Reverend Damian Lake, as I do the tools for post-pandemic ministry. If you are interested in the tools for budgets and stewardship during COVID, you will find the link over in the chat where you can click on that separate Zoom link. It'll invite you to go there and to leave this meeting, and you want to click yes, and it'll take you to that meeting. So again, this is tools for post-pandemic ministry. So I know some of your faces, some of you are pastors in our conference, and so it's good to see some of those familiar faces. And some of you are serving or have served in different capacities throughout our conference, and then some of you are members of churches and leadership committees. And so I have probably met some of you, but certainly not all of you. But I'm glad that you are with me today, and you have chosen to stay with me in this space as we talk about those tools for post-pandemic ministry. First, I think we all can come to agree that this time in ministry over what's almost been a full year, believe it or not, we're coming around to that, has been indeed a challenging time. I think we've talked about that in different spaces today. We've acknowledged that already in our conversations. And I just want to say that it is a challenge, but it has taught us some new tools that we can have in our toolbox. And I think that is something that that Jenny and myself, we hope that you can take away from our time together today, is some of those tools, what you've already been using, and then maybe add a few more as you continue to do ministry in this time. So I want to talk about a few things today in regards to kind of thinking about what happens as the vaccines that are already coming out, as we begin to get vaccinated, and as we start to think about what does it look like after we are able to kind of come back? What are some of the things that we should be thinking about? What are some of the things that we should maybe be doing? So I want to start by talking about how we are caring for one another. And I think that what is important for us is that we have learned, and I have heard of some of these stories in many of our congregations, where the congregations have become creative thinkers when it comes to caring for one another. And so I've heard some stories and where congregations have created what I might call a care committee, where members volunteer from the church to write notes, to pick up the phone and call one another, and to kind of just do a general check-in and saying, how are you doing today? How are things going? And I think one of the greatest things about that is that it's that reminder that we are to care for one another, and how important that is. And so the first thing I want to say is that is great. And I appreciate the churches that are doing that kind of work within their own church body. I also want to encourage you to keep doing that work. And if you haven't started that, maybe this is an opportunity for you to start a ministry like that, where you can reach out to one another and provide just a listening ear. That's really all it is. And what I will say is that when our pastors get supported in this way, by helping to care for the congregation, that what we end up with is a stronger, connected congregation. When we care for one another, we certainly begin to really love one another more. So I think that's really great that we can do that. And one of the things that I think is helpful is that if you are listening to someone who's sharing with you some of the things that are that's weighing on their minds, if there's something as you're listening that says, maybe there's more there, and I'm not a trained pastor, and I don't have that skill set, but what I do know is I can call the pastor, I can email the pastor, I can text the pastor, and I can say, Pastor, this person really seems like they're struggling with something, and I think they really need to talk to you, the pastor. So it's a great way to, when you're listening, is to just pay attention to what you're hearing, and to make sure to kind of record some of those things. And I'm going to get some questions along the chat, and I appreciate that. I'll try to answer some of those. I think I've got one that's asking, anyone here familiar with Faith, Life, and Logos platform for ministry? All right. I am not familiar with that, but if somebody else is and you want to respond to that, Peter is asking that question, and if you want to respond to that in the chat box, that'd be great. Laura is asking, we named our group PALS, Prayer and Loving Support. Yeah, that's excellent, Laura. So that's exactly what I'm talking about, is doing something that is caring for one another when we're really in a time of great stress in our lives. And sometimes, quite honestly, we may not even realize how much we really need our church family to call us. And, somebody who's familiar, somebody who we're used to seeing at coffee hour as an example, or somebody that we often will go to lunch with, maybe even after worship. Those are people in our lives that certainly need those calls and need to hear from us. Rob asks, how do you structure the sort of group for listening, assigning people to certain lists? So great question, Rob. I think one of the ways to kind of structure it first is, of course, to find a group of willing participants, and then to kind of share with those participants that are willing to do this work, to kind of meet with them separately as the pastor, and to go over with them a little bit of some of, like, what do we listen for? How do we know when somebody's in stress? What are some key factors? For most of our pastors, you've had probably have had a CPE course, or you've done pastoral care at a seminary course. You've had some ideas, and you've been pastoring, so you know these things. So kind of sharing some of your knowledge as the pastor with our leadership will be really important, so that they can know what to look for or listen for when they're having a conversation with somebody. The other piece of this is not just caring for our members, but also for our members to remember you have a pastor who needs to be cared for too. So our pastors, from our church leadership to our pastors, they need to know that you as the church leadership are supporting them in their ministry. Now, many of our pastors are very humble, and they don't always share with you that what they're going through every week, and that's certainly understandable, and we don't want to cross any boundaries here. But what we do want to say is that just once in a while, it's great for the pastor to get a call from one of the leadership and just say, hey, how are you doing? How are things going for you? I can't imagine how stressful this must be to create these virtual worship services every week, or to continue to do your work in this new kind of pandemic era, and what that must be like for you. And we don't expect our pastors to necessarily just unload. We don't encourage that either. But what we're saying is that creating a healthy conversation and allowing the pastor to just say, well, thank you for reaching out and giving us a chance to giving me a chance as a pastor to share with you kind of how I'm feeling or what's going on. And so that's a good thing. That also kind of piggybacks with our pastoral relations committees. Those become really important pieces to continuing to do good ministry, and to be able to have that space for your pastor to really confidently be able to share kind of what they're feeling right now, what's been going on in their lives. And we also encourage you to think about, how can you celebrate the pastor's ministry in your church? How can you do things to honor the extra work that they've been doing beyond the call of duty, really, at this time during the pandemic? Are there things that you could do to, give them a little extra vacation time, maybe? Maybe you can help out with creating worship service, or maybe you have a message you'd like to share with the congregation, and maybe that would replace a sermon on a Sunday, as an example. So there's many ways to kind of think about that, but we want to encourage you to think about, how can we support one another in this time as we continue with this. I want to come back to member visits. So some of the churches are asking me, like, how do we do a visit if we're in pandemic? How do we go when we can't go to somebody's home and sit down with them and break bread or share a cup of coffee or tea? So how do we do that? So some ministers that I've spoken with, they've come up with creative ways to do that kind of thing. Now, not only are they just making phone calls, or they're maybe using this new technology of Zoom to connect with one another, but also some of the pastors are doing such things as drive-by visits. Now, that's an interesting concept. I have a particular minister that I know of that has been calling up their church members and saying, I would like to set up a time just to do a quick drive-by. I'm going to drive in my car to your house. I'm going to stay in my car, and I'm going to invite you to be on the phone with me while I'm in my car and you're in your home. And when the weather permits, for them to come out onto the porch even, and to have a conversation where they can see and hear each other, but they're in safe spaces. And that's kind of the drive-by pastoral care option that you might think about. And it's kind of just about getting creative ways to, again, engage in conversation and to let people know that you are there. So yes, the pastor, Cindy's church pastor, says that they do porch visits in the fall, it's a great time to do those kinds of things. So thinking about how we've been doing, kind of the things that we continue to take from what we've been doing, and how do we continue to utilize those as we move forward in this kind of post-pandemic thought process. So there are a lot of churches, a lot of our churches here in the Missouri Mid-South that are doing wonderful, wonderful ministry every week in their Sunday worship. You may be using Facebook as a platform to post your entire worship service. You may be using YouTube to premiere a video every week for people to join in. And those are really great formats. And I want to say that they're great because what you're doing is you're reaching out to different demographics than what you realize. As you promote those videos, as you share those videos of your worship service and what your pastor is saying, you're actually continuing to reach out to newer and newer demographics. So as members of a church, when you attend your church worship on Sunday in a virtual way on Facebook, as an example, you can share that you're watching it so that you can actually be watching it on your own Facebook page. And then people in your Facebook page, your friends, will know what you're doing and they may watch what you're watching. And so it becomes what we call a watch party. So it's really great to kind of continue to kind of promote the message that you're hearing from your pastor and from your church through, on Sunday mornings. So that's one way. Another way is when we've got a couple of pastors that do kind of like daily devotionals or a midweek devotional service that they will offer. Again, they're using Facebook mostly for these kinds of things where they'll go Facebook Live. And as they do that, again, you can, even if you're not live with them, you can watch that video later, and then you can share that video on your Facebook page. This is once again a great way for us to kind of spread that message of God with the world. So it's an incredibly powerful thing when you can create the good content that the pastors are creating. So the other way to do this is to look at the other social media platforms. As an example, we have Instagram. Now, Instagram and Facebook are basically the same. Facebook owns Instagram. And so what you find is that they are able to, kind of interchange or share information as long as you give them the rights to do so. But Instagram has a very different content. Instagram is about pictures. It is mostly pictures, some video content, but it's not like Facebook where you're posting something that you believe or something that you're feeling that day necessarily. Instagram is really focused on, let's share an image, let's share a quick video. And so you have this opportunity through Instagram to really share, these videos. If you wanted to do a quick video series, you could do like a 30-second video every day through Lent, as an example. You could also use Instagram to do a series of just images for February, which is African American History Month. So you could do that as well. And it can be a very powerful way to kind of get your message out there as a church. If as a church you haven't thought about using Instagram as an example, and you just use Facebook, or if you're a church that only has a website and hasn't gone into using Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, you might want to consider that option. Now, it's important to note that this takes a lot of time because you have to be producing content pretty often in order for your page to kind of get noticed more and to get more likes on Instagram. You have to kind of post stuff pretty often. Instagram, you might post something daily. And this doesn't mean that we want this to fall on to the plates of our already busy pastors, but it's a great way for you as a church to get some of your youth involved, as an example. You can have youth get involved with giving them some authorization to post things on Instagram. Of course, this means that you do need to have a conversation with your youth about what things are okay for you to post, what things we're interested in having posted. So that's a great way to kind of build up your youth in your church and build up the relationship that you have with them, and allow them to have some fun and to post some really great stuff that might get some really interesting comments or follows on those pages. There is also another social media platform. It's been mentioned today, at least in one of the sessions that I was in, and that is called TikTok. TikTok is primarily video-based, with people sharing videos, doing recordings, doing silly dances to music that's out there and online that they can have access to. It really is a fresh format. We've moved from Facebook to Instagram to Snapchat to Twitter's kind of always been in the background. That's a whole different platform. And now we're moving into this new world of TikTok. We have many famous people that are actually now starting to create TikTok accounts. They're using those more. This is really where I feel like our youth can really play and do a lot of fun things. And also for our pastors, if you're a pastor and you don't have a TikTok account, that's okay. That's okay. Not everybody's going to do all these things. And again, it does take a lot of time. You can, but if you have some young folks that are in your church and they can share with you a little bit about what TikTok is and how it works, they can show you kind of how to utilize it and what's the best ways for it. But there are probably not too many ministers that I know of at this point that are on TikTok. So that means it's kind of a new era and a new place where you could start to gain some new audience. And so as a pastor, if you like to be fun and silly, and maybe you like to dance around with your dog and do a video of it, or maybe you like to, just do silly things, or just show yourself, kind of being in the church and, and listening to music or whatever that content might be. But do something fun, and that's a great content for us to be thinking about. You've gained more followers probably because of social media and posting. And so what we don't want to see happen, we encourage you not to lose the audience that you've started to gain and the audience that you could be gaining, more of an audience that you could be bringing to find you on the internet. And so it's really important to kind of keep doing what you're doing. One of the things I tell churches I've been preaching this to churches actually for quite a while, and that is that when we're thinking about when the idea of hiring somebody new to be in the front office, we don't answer the phones probably quite as much as we used to. We don't type on typewriters and type up letters and mail things out as much as we used to. So the idea of hiring somebody that can do some social media as well as some of the office administrative stuff that needs to be done on a day-to-day, that's a great way to start rethinking that model of who that front office person is. So they could do some more of that social media. And if you can create a job description that includes some of those pieces and in it, that's a great way to start to kind of expand what you're doing with that role and to continue to kind of reach out and connect with folks. So just want to come over here to the chat a minute because I know I keep going here and I'm missing some of the conversations. Yeah, Cindy Berker says she's got an account on TikTok. Yes, it is. And she says it is addicting and a black hole of time. It can be a black hole of time. You can lose literally not just minutes, but hours scrolling through some of the content. I am a big car guy. So like my TikTok is full of car videos, which any of you who know me will not be surprised by that. Sharing the Facebook post, Rick mentions is church Facebook post is very powerful outreach. So yes, I agree that that's an excellent way to do that. And we need to keep doing that. Putting your messages, if you're doing electronic newsletter, which I think most of our congregations are using electronic newsletters each week, you can put those videos in there. You notice if you are signed up for our e-courier from the conference office, you'll notice that between Ginny and myself, we post a weekly little quick video and we announce what the content is, and we put that right up in the e-courier. But you can actually go to YouTube and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And then you will see that content that gets loaded every week. And that's another important piece of this. Churches that use YouTube, you want to make sure that you subscribe to that channel. The more subscribers you get on YouTube, the higher the ranking is, and the more likely others outside of your church community will start to find your church. So that's really good to know. Other questions here. All right, so Stephen says, any suggestions on how to keep members connected with church who do not have computers or smartphones? Yeah, absolutely, Stephen. So I think, again, one of those ways, we still need to remember that we have lots of members who do not know how to use social media, don't have those kinds of accounts. We have members who are not electronically savvy. So we can get creative about those things. I think we can still use some of our older ideas, our more traditional ideas, ways of, mailing out a newsletter with an update. We have pastors that can, if they've got their sermon that's all typed out or written out, they can send copies of that to church members so they could read those sermons at home in their free time. So that's ways to do it. Making those phone calls, again, is going to be really important to get those phone calls from other members in the church. And maybe, just maybe, the church member has a family member, doesn't necessarily have to attend your church, but maybe that family member is comfortable on using virtual technology. And so they can come over on Sunday morning and worship with that parishioner. And together, the family members are together and worshiping with the church. I've seen that recently when I worshiped a couple of weeks ago with one of our churches. And that's a very powerful way to continue to kind of bring new people in. Maybe they were a member of the church a long time ago and they haven't been for a long time, but now, mom or dad needs a little bit of help with this technology and getting on a Sunday morning. So that's a great way, I think, to engage that way. Another question from Michael, do you have some job description paragraphs or sentences for the office persons? Michael, that is great. I may have some of that information. If you want to email me during the week, I would gladly try to get back to you with some of those that I may have still in my files. And my email is in the chat at the top of it or closer to the top, but it's Damien, DAMIEN @mmsucc.org.
Thank you.
Yeah. So remembering to, again, just to stay connected, keeping doing what you're doing in the many ways that you're doing it. Thinking about when we do have the opportunity to return. Now, I think, again, what we've learned here is some very valuable tools. One of the tools that I think that we've learned is that masks are not a dirty thing. Well, they're not a dirty thing from the perspective of they're not, a cuss word. They're not something nasty. In fact, if we've learned that masks are helping to keep our germs away from one another. Now, I'm not suggesting that when you get back to worship and this is post-pandemic, so everybody's vaccinated and all is well, that we go back, that you keep wearing masks. But what I would say is one of the things we've learned is that you can, if you're not feeling well, put on a mask. That can help, right? Even if it's one or two. And I think because we've gotten used to seeing folks wearing their masks, it's not a strange sight if somebody were to come into church and be wearing a mask, and we're not likely to assume that there's something bad there. It's just that they're trying to keep us safe, right? Those of us who are healthy and well. But when we do return, we want to think about things like coffee hours, community meals. We have been doing community meals in churches forever, right? Jesus said, go out and feed the people. Well, we like to feed people, and I'm a pastor first, and so I love to eat, and I'm sure as many of you do too. We enjoy our food, our snacks, and whatever. So after worship, that time is really, really important. So post-pandemic, though, let's think about what we've learned. What have we learned about food and in our hands, and how dirty our hands get, even if we're just shaking hands with one another, or even if I just reach up and I touch my glasses, I've got oils from the glasses that are attached to my face. Those are the kinds of things we want to be thinking about. So maybe instead of doing like a bowl of, let's just say you've got goldfish, right? Those little crackers. Instead of having a bowl of those out for the kids, maybe what you do is you put them in little cups so that the kids can just grab a cup full of goldfish instead of reaching in and grabbing a handful. There are always those little kids, however, that will grab for more, grab into a bowl, or they'll grab, touch many things. But trying to keep in mind that we want to kind of create more safety for those of us, so that we aren't kind of sharing too many germs. We're always going to have some germs that are going to be shared, but trying to be kind of conscientious of how we've done that in the past. Thinking about, things, community things is really important. Even when we think about communion, right? We've maybe learned that communion can be done with a small communion cup, if you can see that, with a wafer, and it's pre-sealed. So you can order these online. It's a communion cup with juice in it, and it's got a wafer in the bottom of the cup. And so they're all pre-sealed and they come that way. These are gluten-free options. So you can get those and order those and continue to use those. And it's in many ways, this is a healthier way to prevent us from reaching and ripping off a piece of bread or dipping into a cup. It's a different way of doing things. And I know many of our churches use small cups for juice. It's just handed on a tray. So I understand you have those options too. So think about some of those things. The other thing I wanted to share is the idea that what we've learned from using these electronics for church business. Now, many of our churches continue to do board meetings and gatherings using Zoom format. I think for many of our church members, we've gotten very comfortable in these last several months utilizing technology to keep us connected and allow us to do the work that we are called to do for the church. We've also utilized it in many of our work environments. So lots of people are working from home. Lots of people are using Zoom every day, using emails. So how can we take some of those things that we've learned about utilizing Zoom and getting comfortable on these platforms now? How can we take that and continue to use it? So maybe this invites you to think about your monthly meeting for your church leadership. Maybe every month it isn't a let's get together post-pandemic, of course, but maybe it's every other month we get together, and the opposite months we do Zoom. It's just a way to keep us fresh using the technology that we've learned, first of all. And secondly, we actually might find that there are church members who currently aren't really engaging or wanting to serve on our church boards and leadership roles that might now do that if there is a virtual way for them to join. So this is a great way to think about things, is to think about what we can do. So maybe it's an every other month, maybe it's every third month, but just a way to kind of keep utilizing this kind of a platform as a way of continuing to do things. That also means that maybe in your boardroom or your space where you gather, if you haven't already invested in, you might want to invest in a TV with a camera and a computer so that you can at least zoom in folks who let's say they're just not feeling well today, and they could join for the meeting via Zoom, but they're not really comfortable coming or driving to church for a meeting. So that's another great way that you can continue to use this platform and include those who are unable to get to church, for that meeting. That means that you can also, if you haven't already, you can continue that kind of worshiping online tool as well, which I didn't mention before, but continuing to worship online, creating good content for folks to watch for worship on Sunday mornings, even when you come back to worshiping in person. So that's another great way to keep doing that. Also, you think about this when it comes to things like annual meetings. I know many of our churches have already gone through an annual meeting in the pandemic. Some of you may already be planning for one. Maybe it's coming up this week, or you have one in the next couple of weeks. Think about electronic voting. That might not be currently in your bylaws, but it is something maybe to take into consideration, is having an electronic format for voting. And it's something that you can definitely work into the bylaws, and you can make that part of those bylaws, so that for future use, people can submit their votes for the new leadership structure, or for approving bylaws. They can do that electronically kind of going forward. So that's a great way to kind of keep thinking about how do we use technology to kind of help us and encourage us to continue to use the technology and to do some of the church business, if you will. If you are having an annual meeting and you are using Zoom, there are tips and tricks to using Zoom. You saw today in the first session how we used a polling device. You can also create, you can do your voting electronically, and you create those as separate poll questions through the main Zoom page. We are glad at the conference level to help you kind of figure out how to do that if you're not familiar with it. You can also just Google Zoom help and put in whatever question you have, and Zoom has lots of videos as well as there's lots of Q&A and discussion boards about how to do some of the tips and tricks to using Zoom for yourself and for your meetings. I know there's been some other activity. It looks like you're talking to each other, which is great. Thank you. Starting a Facebook group for your church where folks can see photos in the life of the church. I think this is in reference to kind of how we stay connected with one another. That's great. I think that's really important. The more activity you have on Facebook and posting pictures and of members. One thing that one of the churches did is that I was made aware of is they created a video of each member would just do a quick picture, a digital picture of themselves holding up a sign that said something about the church, like praying for the church, or I love my pastor, or I miss coffee hour, or whatever it was. And they would take a selfie, right? And they take the selfie with that poster held up, and then they sent that in, and then the church administrator or the church pastor put all of those together and made a little video and put a little music in there and a little introduction. And they used that and posted it before worship on Sunday. And then they posted it on the Facebook page of the church so that they could find it later on during the week. And it was great. It was positive. It was, encouraging, and remembering that we love our church and we love one another. So questions besides what's already been in the chat, if we're running out of time here, but anybody have questions for me that I can answer about some of the things? Cindy says, love those ideas. I know a church that had the children and youth of the church record why I love my church. Yeah, that's great, Cindy. Cindy, if you don't know who Cindy is, she does our youth and works with our youth in the conference, and she does wonderful work. She's a great resource, by the way. So if you have youth in your church, or you're trying to draw a youth to the church, she's great to contact and reach out to Cindy about some of those things. Other questions? The current guidelines, yes, guidelines for reopening. So we do not have one as an updated one as of yet from Jenny and myself in conference council, but I believe we'll be discussing it soon, and hopefully we'll get something put out about that. I know that there are many conversations around when do we start to think about going back. That always seems to kind of be coming back around. And I know that we're having, there is this concern over a new strain of the virus that has been brought up. And that's a big piece. We don't know for sure how those vaccines are going to be, how well they'll be suited to help protect us from that new strain. So I think that's part of what we're talking about and considering. I'm sure if you have good resources for following up on that, Johns Hopkins is a great resource for things around COVID and some of those things. So if you have other questions about that, but we're not really sure what that's going to look like at this point. So we don't have a whole lot on that. Awesome. Well, I want to thank you all for your attendance. It's time for us to call this workshop to a close. I'm going to say thank you again for attending. And if you have questions or would like to talk more about some of these things, by all means, like I said, email me and let me know how I can be of assistance to you. And I will say that we'll break now. We'll go to lunch. And I think we come back for our next sessions at 12:15. So enjoy the rest of your time with us today. Thank you so much.
The health of the congregation.
Jenny, can I say something?
Yes, please.
Sometimes, you don't, on email, you can't see somebody's face or their gestures. And in a group of emails not too long ago, I guess there was a question about how someone was feeling about something and how that may have affected me. And so our council president, who had actually written the email, came to the parsonage, and we stood out on the porch and had an absolutely wonderful conversation. And I can't tell you how much that meant to me, that he made the effort to come and talk with me and see where I was and make sure I understood. It was just really meaningful.
I really appreciate that, Kristen. I think that is an essential part of leadership, both from the moderator's perspective and the pastor. We are not always going to agree. And what we have to do is be able to talk to one another and engage in order to grow and develop our relationship and our ministry together. I want to just recognize in the chat a couple of other comments about the role of the moderator is to ensure the council follows the bylaws, to provide the evaluation with input of others to the pastor, to facilitate coordination of the work of the various teams responsible for different functions within the church, and provide leadership visible to the congregation. And our keynote speaker this morning talked about the distinction of governance, which is the role and responsibility of the church council, and ministry, which is the role and the responsibility of the staff with the supervision of the pastor. That work that she mentioned, I want to focus on in this time together. And I'm going to show, it's about a 9-minute video by the person who really put a lot of that work together. His name is Dan Hotchkiss. He wrote a seminal book called Governance and Ministry, where he lays out exactly this. What is the role between the church council and the pastor and the staff? And so I'm going to share my video and play this because I think it's really important for us in understanding the role of the church council. So bear with me for just a moment.
So what's governance and what's ministry? Well, I like to think of them as two kinds of power that it makes sense for a congregation to delegate separately. Governance is the basic job of the board, which is to think about the mission of the congregation constantly, to ask the question of how are we going to choose to carry out that mission? Who are we going to empower to take action in behalf of the congregation? And how are we going to hold those that we give power to accountable? In some ways, the work of governance in a congregation is like the job of governance or the work of the board of a business corporation. But there's some important differences, mainly having to do with a word that often comes up when we talk about boards, which is the word fiduciary. A fiduciary is a person or a group that have a duty to act in the interest of another, even if that is in conflict with their own interest. So, for example, oftentimes we think of a fiduciary as someone who holds money in behalf of a minor child, for example. A banking trust department will do that sometimes. And their duty is to act in the interest of that child, even if that's in conflict with the interest of the fiduciary or the bank itself. The job of a business corporation board is to act as a fiduciary for the stockholders. The stockholders are the owners of the company. They're entitled to benefit from its work. And the job of the board members is to act as the stockholders would benefit, even if the individual board members might have a conflicting interest. For example, a board member who also is an owner of a company that supplies to the company needs to set that role aside. That conflicting interest may need to recuse himself or herself from a board meeting. That's being a fiduciary. And you're always a fiduciary for someone. In the case of a business corporation, you're being a fiduciary for the stockholders who want to make money out of the business. If I went to a congregation and asked, who is the board the fiduciary for? I might get a number of different answers. Some people might say, oh, it's the denomination. Some people might say it's God. Some people might say it's the membership. In fact, most of the members in most kinds of American congregations and Canadian congregations would say the members are the group for whom the board is the fiduciary. I actually disagree with that. And here's why. You can't divide up the assets of a church and write everybody a check. A business can do that because the stockholders of a business are the owners, but the members of a congregation are not the owners. In fact, I think that when members at a congregational meeting vote, they vote just as the board members do, as fiduciaries. But fiduciaries for what? For whom? Who's the owner of a congregation? The best answer I know is that the owner of a congregation is the mission. It's the mission that's entitled to benefit from the congregation's work. It's the mission that should be the criterion for determining the fiduciary duty, not just of board members, but of congregants when they vote. So at a congregational meeting, if any individual congregant has a choice between what he or she individually prefers and what would best serve the mission of the congregation, that congregant's duty is to vote the mission. So that's the work of governance, is to hold the congregation in trust for its mission. Ministry is, in a sense, everything else. It's most of what you see in a congregation. It's the active part of the work of the congregation. Serving the cause, giving institutional leadership, making things happen. Also conserving and deploying resources like money, buildings, and time. And the work of ministry is led by a group that I'll call the staff. I'm not really interested so much in whether people are ordained or not ordained, or paid or not paid, even though I know that the people themselves are often very interested in those things. I'm interested in what they're doing and the people who are taking action in behalf of the congregation or supporting those who do, providing the necessary resources for action, are the people who are engaged in ministry. And whatever group is in charge of that, empowered to make it happen, I call the staff. And I'm leaving aside a whole lot of questions about how to organize for ministry internally and how to make things happen, how to hold that whole ministry organization accountable. That's important work, and those are important questions for the board to think about, along with the people who are in charge of ministry. But that's the difference between governance and ministry. And to me, a really healthy and efficient way of making decisions in a church gives decision-making authority to those, for those different kinds of power separately. But also to relate the two in several really critical ways. One is to have the board adopt policies that direct and guide the work of ministry. They're not controlling it or supervising it or running it directly, but they are creating the boundaries and delegating the authority and providing for accountability, which is the reverse relationship. That's, in the formal sense, that's where the staff speaks to the board, is by way of accountability, and the way this board speaks to the staff is by way of policies. That's one part of the relationship. The other has to do with a shared area of leadership that I call planning. We could also call it discernment or visioning, but most generally I call it planning. And that's because you really can't divide the world up so neatly as everything is either governance or ministry and nothing is both. In fact, when you're planning, when you're generating the sense of overall understanding of mission and the priorities that you're going to follow to achieve your mission, that's work where you need to end up with complete buy-in on both sides, And the only way to achieve that is to have complete involvement on both sides, not just of people in leadership positions, but also people in the congregation or even on the periphery of the congregation. The reason being that effective planning is strategic planning, is visionary planning. It's engaging the adaptive questions, the really scary edge questions that are most important when you're thinking about the future together. The work of planning is in the overlap or shared area because it needs to be concerned both with learning from experience, which is where the ministry leadership has the most to contribute. It has to do with the ultimate responsibility for following the mission, which is the board's core responsibility, and because it requires the involvement of people who aren't in leadership at all. The congregation itself and even people on the edges of the congregation or outside it have a great deal to contribute when you're really thinking about the future and about things that are not currently part of your habitual way of doing business, but instead are going to be the way that you meet the needs of a changing world and a changing environment.
Okay, so want to kind of check in with you and whoops. Well, just a moment and let me oh, just a second, sorry. Okay, sorry about that. So I wanted to just kind of check in and what did you hear? What came up for you? One of the reasons why I wanted to show that whole video is because he does a great job of really laying out these differences, and that the moderator, especially in this time of the pandemics, really has to has a huge responsibility to the governance, the fiduciary responsibility, both the financial, but also do we have policies in place that we need to have? So was there anything from the video that you heard or was new for you? As we're kind of waiting, one of the pieces that I want to name for the moderator, and a part of what I heard in one of the questions in this morning's keynote was related to the issue of the church council knowing its role and the minister or staff knowing its role. And something that happens is that the church council becomes very excited and passionate and begins to seep over and micromanage the ministries of the church, and that there's challenges with that in terms of that piece. The other question that I heard raised was, how do you cultivate new church council members, which is a part of, I think, the awareness and oversight of the church council moderator, especially in churches where they may be smaller, and sometimes we have to rotate members to lead from that perspective. I would really encourage you, if that's the case, if you serve a small or a member of a small church where there's not a pool of new people or resources or things like that, I would encourage you to make sure that people who have served on the church council for 1 or 2 terms really do take a break and go rest, Sabbath or sabbatical, if you will, so that they can renew themselves and return back, and that there are members out there. How do we cultivate them? My suggestion would be to invite them to participate in something of ministry. Nobody wants to volunteer to be the head or the church council member for 6 years. Usually they become invited into ministry in some way, and we cultivate their skills and leadership. So as moderator, I would encourage you to consider doing that from that perspective. Okay, so the chat says, let's see, the recording will be available. In our smaller congregation, we are struggling to fill roles. I'm currently the treasurer, and we use QuickBooks. Sorry, I'm trying to go through them very quickly.
And Jenny, I don't mean to
Yes.
interrupt the chat
No,
review.
please.
But,
No,
I do
go
have a
ahead.
question. So one of the things I think we struggle with, and I'm a council member, is that we've got a number of committees. We do have some council members that are also on those committees, and so they can provide context in the council meetings about what's going on. But the reports that we get from the committees are pretty short and sweet, and not, I don't think, illustrative of what they're really grappling with. There's not a lot of, I need help with this. So how do we encourage more, especially during the pandemic where we're just doing Zooms and everybody can't be on every meeting? How do we encourage that communication between the council and the other lay leaders in the church to make sure that council really understands the depth and breadth of what's going on in the church, and not just getting these snippets that really probably don't tell us enough about what is going on and what needs to occur?
Kristen, I think that's a great question. And it's a challenge in terms of sometimes the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing in terms of, the church council is responsible for those committees. But if there's not representation on the church council, or if that communication is not very strong, then you may not know what's going on. I think that's my suggestion would be some direct communication, either from the moderator or the executive committee. If you're not hearing from those committees, that may also be some assessment of, are those committees working, functioning? If they aren't, do we need to retain that committee, or is there another way to do that ministry? If the committee is active and they're going rogue, that I think is concerning as well, because you need to make sure that you know what's going on, and the pastor and staff need to be able to support and equip the committees from that perspective. So I would say figure out a way, which I think is the proverbial task, of communicating with the committee, and it might just be a regular call or email or text with maybe 4 or 5 questions. What did you meet this month? What were the items on your agenda? What support do you need from the church council? What challenges are you facing at this time that we could support you with? So those kind of open questions might invite a little bit more engagement, rather, sometimes, to submit a report, that, could be overwhelming for someone who's really busy.
Yeah,
Does
I-
that
I
help,
like-
Jeannie,
It does. I like the question, what challenges are you facing right now and what help do you need? Because I think that's what we're maybe missing.
Mm-hmm.
I have last month as my first function as vice president, I have attended cabinet meeting and asked each cabinet member what their concerns were, and then the following day I brought it to council verbally. And it wasn't, some things were older things, but some things were very pressing that had to be addressed. So I think I totally agree with you that the vice president has to ask each cabinet what's going on, what are your concerns, and needs to bring it to council. Absolutely.
This all feels fairly overwhelming to me. I'm not new to being a church president. It's a lot of work. And this description of from the video is reminiscent of a full-time CEO. I've got a full-time job. This isn't it.
Yeah.
I'm not getting paid for this. How do we bring some balance to this whole balancing act?
Yeah. So Donna, I first want to affirm you and support you, and say that you are not alone. I often hear church council members and moderators say, this is a volunteer position that is 40 plus hours a week. It can be. So that would be my first comment. My second comment would be, take this in bites. So all of this, if we receive this, all of this, even just this workshop right now, and say, oh my gosh, I'm not doing that. Oh my gosh, it will feel debilitating and overwhelming. And so what I would suggest is, take a bite. What could you do, to help more clearly define your church council's role in governance, in terms of oversight, the finances, what does the budget look like? If that is still overwhelming, that's okay. I think we have to start somewhere. Laura Dearborg Ayers gave a great link to a nonprofit website that focuses on board resources. One of the things that I was going to suggest to moderators is, if you have council members that are the same people, and it's hard to kind of, inspire newness, especially in this moment, I would encourage you to maybe do a book study together. And do something that kind of talks about what is our role, and do it with the pastor, from that perspective. Something that really begins to kind of ease your way in, so that you're not feeling as overwhelmed. Does that? I hope that helps, Donna.
Well,
I want to go ahead.
I have an issue. I mean, in terms of when the role of the moderator is to help bring people into leadership positions who are younger, I'm finding that we have an intergenerational issue here. By that, I mean, the younger generations of church members are much more focused on doing something project oriented as opposed to governance oriented. So, we all want this talent in the church, but a lot of the younger generation, particularly, what do you call them, millennials, really don't want to commit to governance positions. So have you run into this with other congregations?
I think that you've got your finger on the pulse of church in the 21st century, and that was pre-pandemic, and especially right now. The statistics and research shows that younger generations, younger being, you know, I'm Gen X, which I'm not really young, and millennials, the younger generations are not signing up to do church, and to do it as we've always done it. And one of those pieces is, younger generation members are not going to sign up for a committee. What they will sign up for is, something specific. And then when they get their foot in the door, if they believe in that organization, the church, they're more willing to get involved. But they don't want to spend, a 3-hour meeting for a church council, and some things like that. One of the pieces that I will offer in my resources, and I'm aware of time, so I want to finish up in a second, is from Dan Hodgkiss, and it's an article about 3 ways to make board meetings less excruciating, which on Zoom, that's really important. And essentially the 3 are to ban oral reports, meaning let those be written reports. Don't go over them, but just, let them be as they are. Number 2 would be to use a consent agenda. And a consent agenda is where all of the the meeting minutes approval and some of those pieces that are the routine parts of church council meetings, bundle that together in your agenda before that you send out. Say this is the consent agenda, and then at the meeting you vote on all of those items in a concise manner, so that you can spend more time focused on the big picture and the governance of what is happening. And the third piece that he suggests is to start a board policy book. What are the policies of your church that you need to be aware of, but right now they're either unspoken or unwritten or unspoken, that people just kind of know. You need to have that in some kind of writing from that perspective. So I'll include that in the material that I send. The last piece that I want to share, and I shared this in the pastor relations, but I will include this for this as well. If there is conflict in your church, if there is conflict with your pastor, if it gets to the point where it is becoming debilitating and toxic, hopefully before it gets to that point, please reach out to me as conference minister, to Damian Lake as associate conference minister, and or to your committee on ministry. And if you don't know who those individuals are, message me and I will send you their information, because we have a process in the manual on ministry called a situational support consultation. And it's essentially, it allows the committee on ministry to come in and offer a third-party facilitator when there is conflict. It works best when the conflict is not at a 10 level of everybody is yelling and screaming at each other. It is intended to really work through that conflict to prevent it from getting to the level 10. So it's a really good, healthy tool. And or we can always recommend consultants to help you either with conflict or if you're looking for visioning and things like that. I want to be aware of time, and we've got about 5 minutes. We're not gonna go into a break, but we'll go into the keynote. Are there any final thoughts, questions that you want to make sure that I identify or that you want to share? Some of y'all have done a great job of sharing resources and things like that. Anything else?
I had a question.
Mm-hmm.
How are these going to be available after Thursday? How do you access them then?
So we will do two things. We will email it to everyone who registered for today.
Oh, thank you. Okay, thank you.
And we will also put it in the e-courier, which is our email that we send out. If you do not get a weekly email from us and you would like to, just put it in the chat, and we will include you in our subscription so that you get our emails. I strongly encourage that for all of our church councils, so that you know events and things that are going on in the conference, and you can have that information as well.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure I spelled that right, but yes, I would like to.
That's
be included in
perfect.
that.
Thank you, Linda. We'll put you in.
Thank you.
I want to end just by saying thank you. I truly do believe that you are called to be on the church council, and those of you who are moderators and presidents, you have been called for such a time as this. And it may not feel like it, especially when it feels like this is a second full-time unpaid job. But I really appreciate your service and your commitment to the body of Christ and the expression of your local church. We need you. And if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to us. I want to help you so that you can live out your ministry in your local church. Okay, we're going to take a quick stretch, and we'll get started at around 1 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you.
As we are waiting, I would invite you to share, if you would like to, what is one thing that you are excited about in your church's ministry and or with your pastor right now at your church? You can put it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and share. It's always good to hear good, exciting, joyful things that are happening.
This is Kathy Bayer, and I just wanted to share that we're excited that we have, as a result of our pastor doing, Facebook live streaming on Sunday mornings and on Wednesday evenings. She's been doing it. We have 3 new folks who have started attending church, and that has been, I mean, we have maybe 16 people in church on Sunday. So to have 3 people come is fabulous.
That is so exciting, Kathy, and such a creative and wonderful opportunity to reach out to people who might not have come in the doors of your church before that. That's great.
Thank you. Thank you for Liz.
Oh, Pastor Liz is wonderful, a gift. And I look forward to seeing her Facebook live videos with her dog. So that's always good.
Yeah.
Gary Teppenkamp shares developing a community garden as ministry. That's St. John's Chapel in Springfield, which is so wonderful. I look forward to hearing what crops are growing right now. Marie Scala, Lenten book study Zoom sessions will start soon. I look forward to hearing what book y'all are reading. Oh, there you go. Thanks to Pastor Rick. Our book club sessions are always fascinating. I know Pastor Rick had to be an anti-racist recently. I don't know if y'all are still doing that. At Pilgrim during pandemic, we have had wonderful worship, including beautiful art, Advent study and box, community events for food giveaways, and for food insecurity issues. Pilgrim in St. Louis, yes, we will miss Pastor James and the ministry, but I'm so grateful for your ministry on the Del Mar Divide. And you're reading The Last Week by Marcus Borg. That's great. Wonderful. Well, welcome back. I'm glad that y'all are here. And Mary Nelson, are you on? Yes, there you are.
Hi there, I'm here. This sounds like I just caught the tail end of Ginny's workshop, and it just sounds like you all are doing such wonderful work and really wrestling with important questions. And it was great to hear a little bit of that. So thank you. Thank you again for your love for your churches. That's the heart of why you're here, and what we're all doing here is we're here because we love the church. So keep up the good work. In 2014, I went to my first meeting with a church's 2020 Vision Committee. I remember vividly how puffed up they were and proud at that meeting that they had thought of such a clever name for their committee, and that they were really ahead of the curve with their planning. In 2014, 2020 seemed like a really distant point in the future. They wanted to map out the entire road there. The retirement of their current pastor, the search for the new pastor, the projection of a successful and triumphant future that looked uncannily like their cherished memories of their congregation in the 1980s. And as I drove home from that meeting, full of well-intended people who clearly loved their church and who also clearly wanted to impress their regional minister, I braced myself for the onslaught of 2020 Vision committees that were to come in the following years, and for the inevitable 2020 hindsight jokes that would surely come after that. Of course, now we all know that 2020 hindsight jokes would be so true and so painful that we cannot bring ourselves to utter them. I appreciated the twist of the 2020 bingo card humor that arose instead last year, and I sometimes found myself wishing for a real bingo card. Those little squares would have been really useful to provide adequate warning, I think, for the events of the year. Global pandemic, economic catastrophe, murder hornets, disputed election, online worship, and also the slowing down, reprioritizing, and innovation that have happened as well. If only our 2020 Vision committees had been given a bingo card years ago. I'm sure you can predict how that first 2020 Vision committee's work turned out. None of the dreams they had set forth for their church panned out the way they'd planned. And none of that disappointment was because of anything that actually happened in 2020 itself. Their pastoral transition didn't follow the timeline they'd set. Their worship attendance dwindled just like everyone else's. Their Sunday school and youth group diminished. Their stewardship numbers lagged. Their staff grew demoralized. Their hidden conflicts bubbled to the surface. Their board chairs burned out and left the church. And all that happened well before the sun peeked over the horizon on January 1, 2020. Their vision didn't fall short because they'd convened the committee too early. It didn't fall short because their goals were too lofty, or their scope was too big, or their attachment to the past was too strong. Their 2020 vision dreams fell short because they were trying to manage an image rather than trying to lead a community. Most of our churches have been living like this. We confuse when it is right to manage and when it's right to lead. And we confuse the congregational identities we carry in our heads and in our hearts with the actual people who make up our congregations. The last time most of our churches thoroughly examined our structures and our decision-making processes and our theological convictions was in the 1950s and 60s, when the baby boomers were in high school and the suburbs were exploding and the Niebuhr brothers were popular household names. We've been making do with a particular white supremacist, capitalist, corporate business culture wrapped in a tissue of self-congratulation ever since. And that culture isn't serving Christ or Christ's church very well. But most of us haven't yet figured out what else to do. Shrinking our committee sizes is hard enough. Imagining some completely new way to do the work of the church with different committees or without committees is something that most of us have not been ready to do. Meanwhile, the narrative of decline has been wearing us down. The statistics of shrinking churches, closing churches, the awareness of falling worship attendance and smaller Sunday school classes, the burnout of volunteers and reluctance to take on more work for what feels like less payoff every time, the tighter financial margins as giving decreases every year, and we try to stretch fewer dollars to pay for more ministry, the increasing need in our communities, and the sense that whatever we may be able to do will never be enough. It's too much. It's exhausting. The ways we've always done things clearly aren't working anymore. But we have been too tired, too overwhelmed, too sad, too broke, too broken to try any new ways. We have been in maintenance mode for far too long. And when we are in maintenance mode, everything we do is management. We are keeping things going. We are solving the problem right in front of our faces. We are perpetuating the status quo. When we are in maintenance mode, we are not able to lead. Maintenance mode is not a place for leadership. And we have been in maintenance mode for far too long. We needed a catalyst. We needed an earth-shaking, life-changing event. We needed the heavens to open up and God to come down and save us from ourselves. And what we got was a pandemic. And if God actually came down in a pillar of fire or a cloud of smoke or a shaft of light in 2020, I would not have been surprised. I must have missed it if it happened. But I have no doubt that God was present with us, is present with us in the midst of this experience of actual literal pestilence and death of biblical proportions. In 2019, Susan Beaumont, a noted church leadership consultant, published a book about change in uncertain times. It's called How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You're Going, Leading in a Liminal Season. She wrote this book before the pandemic hit. She talks about several of the theories that describe this moment in the history of the church. Theories that all name that we are in a time of great transition and cultural upheaval, what Beaumont calls a liminal season, when the old ways of doing things are no longer serving well, but new ways have not yet clearly emerged. We have been in such a season for a long time, decades, maybe a couple of generations. We are maintaining systems and programs of a bygone era because we don't know what else to do. It's hard to move into new ways of being and doing church when you don't know what church is going to look like. Walter Brueggemann says in The Prophetic Imagination that the job of a prophet is to help their people imagine the world that comes next, because until we can imagine it, we can't work toward it. But what do we do when we don't yet know the prophets and we don't yet have the imagination of what will be next? We have been scared and we have been stuck. Beaumont says that liminality always begins with an ending, an experience of loss, and humankind resists loss. She's not wrong. Our insistence on staying in maintenance mode has been an attempt to resist the loss of the 20th century church. Our resistance to this loss has been covering our fear, and our fear has been covering our lack of imagination. After an experience of loss comes a period of uncertainty, Beaumont says, when the future is not yet clear. There are fewer and fewer people who remember what the strong institutional church looked like. There are more and more people who have only dim memories of that church. There are more and more people who have never experienced that church and have only known the church that exists now in this liminal time. After the experience of loss and the period of uncertainty, there is a period of reorientation. That's the hope that we hold out for ourselves, that at some point in the future, there will be a period of reorientation, when the prophets will appear who can help us imagine the new church and we can start moving toward it. But in the liminal time, there is nobody who knows what reorientation or resolution looks like. The gift of pandemic life is that we have been forced to abandon maintenance mode. Pandemic has been a pain in the neck, and we did not think we had the capacity for this much change this fast, but we've been forced to adapt, and we've done it. We are doing it. We will keep doing it. The pandemic has given us cause to reassess our priorities and find new ways to do what is of value and to let go of what doesn't serve. We want to come face to face for some gatherings when we are able to again. We don't have to be face to face for every conversation. The ability to talk and meet and make decisions via electronic means has changed how we schedule ourselves and how we set boundaries around our time. The money we normally spend on travel for meetings can be redirected to fund ministry more robustly. Our buildings can be used as gathering spaces for other ministries instead of gathering spaces for planning committees. Beyond the church, shifts in everyday lifestyle choices are having big impacts in other areas. Our air and water are cleaner. Deforestation of the Amazon has decreased. And snow has become more reflective, making it melt more slowly, which then has implications for improved global water supply and fewer flooding events. Women report spending significantly less time putting on makeup for work, leaving them more time to attend to other things they care about more. Animal shelters and humane societies report record demand for pet adoptions. Volunteerism dropped off with the initial shutdown, but since then, virtual volunteerism and overall volunteer engagement and commitment have increased. Overall charitable giving increased by 7.5% in the first half of 2020. And giving to racial justice and diversity, equity, and inclusion programs increased nearly tenfold. White Americans' awareness of racial injustice has increased dramatically as well. Time spent with family has shifted significantly. Time spent commuting has shifted significantly. Time spent consuming has shifted significantly. Time spent working has shifted significantly. Time spent wearing pants has shifted significantly. There is no doubt that this has been a hard year, a terrible year, with global COVID deaths topping 2 million last week. Economic devastation landing entirely on the shoulders of women, especially women of color. Record-breaking levels of gun violence and intimate partner violence. And a civic life so broken that white supremacist domestic terrorism has become the primary threat to America. These changes that 2020 has brought have had environmental impacts, relational impacts, financial impacts, social impacts, and theological impacts. And more people are talking openly about how they don't want to go back to the way things were before the pandemic, especially in the church. This year has taught us that we can do new things. We can learn new ways. We can connect to one another creatively. We can be the beloved community, even as we worship separately in our homes. The UCC's Center for Analytics, Research and Development and Data released survey results just 2 weeks ago on the pandemic's impact on our congregations. Of churches who responded to the survey, 70% said that their online worship had the same or increased attendance compared to in-person worship pre-COVID. Of churches who already had some kind of online worship pre-COVID, 90% reported an increase in worship attendance. 77.5% of churches who added online worship report that they intend to continue offering online worship once COVID regulations go away. And it's not just worship that has been impacted. 70% of responding churches have continued or expanded their outreach, community service, and social justice work. Faith formation offerings for both kids and adults have moved online. Meetings have moved online. These moves have real impact on how individuals and families make choices about their church participation and structure their time. Parents of small children do not have to choose between meeting attendance and bedtime. People who work from home, depending on the type of work they do, have greater access to daytime devotional options and Bible study groups online. Families can worship together in pajamas at the breakfast table or at some other time of the day or day of the week when they can make worship a priority. We miss the fellowship. An online coffee hour or a sermon talkback isn't the same. Isolation of single members and single clergy is a real problem. Issues of Wi-Fi infrastructure and access still create barriers to connecting elderly, rural, and low-income members. But we can do so much more than we knew, and we are doing it well. unchurched people whose faith has been challenged by the experience of pandemic are finding church homes online, and churches are welcoming new members into fellowship. Enthusiasm for attending multiple churches' worship services in a week has risen. Attendance isn't geographically bound, so families who are separated by great distances are connecting by sharing in online worship together. Former church members who have moved away are visiting their old church homes and reconnecting with their communities. And we can be done with managing our churches and maintaining the status quo. We are moving toward leadership instead. Let me remind you again of the passage from Hebrews I shared with you this morning. Remember your leaders, those who spoke the word of God to you. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. Jesus Christ is the same today, yesterday, and forever. Do not be carried away by all kinds of strange teachings, for it is well for the heart to be strengthened by grace, not by regulations about daily matters which have not benefited those who observe them. Leaders set the example, and the most effective leaders set an example that people just want to follow. They don't have to say, hey, look at me, be like me. That happens because the outcome of their way of life is attractive. Effective leaders set norms and standards of behavior that appeal to their communities. And the outcomes of those behaviors are of value to those communities. A leader whose way of life leads to money and glamour is appealing to people who also want money and glamour. A leader whose way of life leads to peace and harmony is appealing to people who want peace and harmony. A leader whose way of life leads to influence and prestige is appealing to people who want influence and prestige, etc. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. So let's talk about what church leadership is, because leadership is not management. And chances are you've gotten very used to doing church management over the years. Management had its place. There are times when management is of value, but we are no longer in one of those times. Your churches have asked you to lead them in this liminal season. So it's important that you know what the tasks of leadership are. The first task of a leader is presence. A leader is present to their community, not just showing up, but actively engaged with the people of the community, attentive to their situation. Presence is a conscious and intentional quality of the leader's existence. Particularly in times of crisis, leaders use their presence to create and hold space that promotes the well-being of the community. The leader's intentionality around presence establishes the conditions the community needs in order to thrive. The second task of a leader is relationship. Leadership is covenantal, relational. Leaders create a culture where every individual is valued, and at the same time, no individual is more valued than the group. Leaders know their people and help them connect to one another in genuine relationship. The next task of a leader is listening. A leader listens to other people and learns from them along the way. Leadership adapts when new input is added and new insights are gained. The next task of a leader is collaboration. Leadership is not power over, but power with, especially in churches that use congregational decision-making processes. Leaders show the way and inspire their churches to follow, partnering with other church leaders to bring the congregation along the path. The next task of a leader is integrity. A leader's words and actions must match one another and must match the values of the church they are serving. That integrity must be rooted in constant self-examination, checking in with themselves. Leadership accepts responsibility for conditions as they are and seeks to improve them. The next task of a leader is to define the mission and to define what is not the mission, and remind the church often of what the mission is. Especially in the church, this is a place where we can trip ourselves up. So I'm going to take an extra moment here. How many times have we had the circular mission and vision conversations? How many times have we written a mission statement that we stick in a drawer when we're done? The task of a leader is to define the mission and keep it at the forefront of our work so that we don't get distracted or fall into old patterns of behavior. Not everything is your church's mission. We have to also be able to differentiate between passion and mission. We are here, we exist as a church to do something, not to do everything. The leader must be prepared to say, no, that idea is a good idea, but it's not our mission. It may be your passion, but it's not our mission. The final task of a leader is to make more leaders. Leadership is forward thinking. We are not here to preserve the past, but to empower the future. Making more leaders is not about self-replication. It's about lifting up the gifts of others. Succession planning is a piece of leadership, but more importantly, leaders are conscientious about setting precedent, and they seek to set up their successors with the freedom to lead for their time. Leadership asks the question, who is the church for? And leadership always knows that the answer is, the church is for the people who will come after us. Remember your leaders, those who spoke the word of God to you. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. Consider the outcome of their way of life. If we are to be effective leaders, we have to consider the outcome of our ways of life. And in this moment in the history of the church, the outcome of our ways of life should not be a return to the ways of life that we knew pre-pandemic. I want to take a little sidebar moment here. We sometimes have used the language of the twin pandemics or dual pandemics, and it's really useful framing for a lot of our bigger picture conversations about this historical moment, in that we need to address the disease of racism, the illness that exists in our society, and name white supremacy as a sickness whose symptoms have stunted the world in which we all live, at the particular expense of Black and brown people. Describing racism as a pandemic is a useful way to make white people see the problem systemically instead of personally. So as I talk about the gifts of pandemic life, I want to be clear that I'm talking about the lifestyle changes, the adaptations, the reprioritization that has come about because of the isolation and risk mitigating measures we have undertaken to slow the spread of the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus. We need to acknowledge the impact and experience of these changes are very different from the impact on and experience of Black and brown lives by the disease of racism. For Black and brown people, the sickness that is white supremacy has forced them to live in isolation and fear, has forced them to plan and defend and mitigate risk every day for centuries. I want to be careful not to minimize the pain of that particular experience. When I talk about the gifts of pandemic life, I need to name that the pandemic of racism has not been a gift, and I don't want to imply that it is. The gift of the coronavirus pandemic is that it can be a catalyst to spark the reorientation at the end of this liminal season. We now have an opportunity to rebuild our ecology, our communities, our governance, our economy, our theologies. And within that opportunity to rebuild is an obligation to right the wrongs of racial injustice on which our previous structures were built. Remember your leaders. Consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith. When the outcomes of former leaders' ways of life are destructive to humanity, we do not have to imitate that faith. We do not want to imitate that faith. Jesus would not want us to imitate that faith. We must find new leaders to follow, new outcomes to pursue, new faith to imitate. And indeed, that is what many people are doing. We have been mystified by the decline of the mainline churches and the rise of conservative evangelicalism for the last 40 years. And if you look at the numbers, the decline of the mainline has been much larger than the rise of conservative evangelicalism. It's not like there was a simple exchange of one brand of church for another. Interest in religion has decreased across the board. And the conservative evangelical churches have been more effective at appealing to the masses than we have. But I also think that we in the mainline church have been extremely successful at exporting our values to the wider culture, and thereby making our institution redundant. The institution of the church once existed to safeguard and promote our values. And we did so well at promoting our values that we just ended up safeguarding the institution instead. That's maintenance mode. Nobody looks for a church community because they want to take on more committee work. Back when I was still a young clergy, I regularly found myself trapped in these conversations centered around the question, where are all the young people? As if I, a young person who was in the church, could speak for my age peers who want nothing to do with the church. Where are the young families, we ask, as if young families are the solution to all our problems, because we want them to replicate and restore for us the bygone 20th century church. But why would they replicate a thing to which they have no attachment? Clearly, they have found other leaders to follow, other paths, other faiths to imitate. The vitality of our churches is not the task of people who are not in our churches. And it is not soccer's fault that they are not here. If we truly want to answer the question, where are the young people? We should look no further than our own sanctuaries and structures and systems for the answer. Instead of asking, where are the young people, we need to start asking, what is the outcome of our way of life? And is our faith worth imitating? I believe that it is worth imitating, but how is anybody supposed to know if we don't tell them? The United Church of Christ is the church that so many people are looking for. We need to be the leaders that the people outside our churches will want to follow. This means we need to be vocal and public and brave about who we are as a church and what our mission is. We need to be careful and intentional about the messages we send out and the spaces we create within. We need to be actively working for racial justice, for the planet's health, for economic justice. The gift of pandemic life is that we can rebuild our church communities with those goals at the center and make them happen. We can be the leaders whose faith others want to imitate. The gift of pandemic life is no less than the opportunity to build God's kingdom come on earth. Thanks be to God. Amen.
Amen.
Mary, I thank you for your wisdom, for your honesty, and for your vision of the goodness of the church in all of its expression, the body of Christ and the expression of the local church, the Missouri Mid-South Conference, the United Church of Christ. I give thanks. And as you mentioned, Richard and Reinhold Niebuhr and Walter Brueggemann, they are children of the Missouri Mid-South Conference. And so we celebrate that as they were the children of the Missouri Mid-South Conference in the 20th century, that John Dorhauer and Tracy Blackman are the children of the Missouri Mid-South Conference and leaders of the United Church of Christ now, that we lean into the joy that the children of the Missouri Mid-South Conference are the children in each of our communities that may never step foot in our local churches ever, but that we are embodying God's love with them so that they may live fully into who God has called them to be in their community and God's creation. Mary, is there anything from your perspective? I know we're going to do closing worship. Did you want to do any kind of final questions or anything like that? Or do you want to take a breather and then go into worship? Oh, you're on mute.
I'm happy to follow your lead, Jenny. If there are pressing questions that folks want to get in, I'm happy to do that. I'm also happy to have you share, have folks email you questions and have you forward them on to me.
Sure.
Follow up for later. I'm happy to go
So,
right in closing worship if you'd like.
I will invite, so I'll give you a second to kind of catch your breath, and I'll do a little bit of announcements and follow up from that, and then we'll start in a few minutes. So the first thing that I would offer to all of you is, if you have any comments, questions in the chat, the second piece, please go ahead and put that in there. The second piece that I would say, and this arose in my second workshop, this sense of feeling overwhelmed with all of the material of today, and the awareness that, as one person said, I have a full-time job. This is my volunteer job. Or my volunteer leadership. And I want to affirm that, and also say, don't feel like you have to take everything, again, using the toolbox. You don't need to get all the tools out today. And if you've never used a leveler, make sure that you use it in the next church council meeting. What we wanted to do was offer you a glimpse or as broad a perspective as possible. And my wisdom to you would be, take one bite at a time. Don't compare yourself to another church. Your church is your church in this moment, and your church has great strengths. One of the books that I was going to offer is, and I'll put it in the chat, a book called Administration in the Small Membership Church by John Tyson. It's an Abington Press book. And there's some really good books, and I'll give a couple of others in my material for smaller churches, since 80% of our churches worship 100 or less. I want to affirm that our smaller churches are very important, especially in this moment, and sustaining and cultivating that energy. And Mary, what I appreciate is you saying, we don't need to maintain what we've done because we've always done it. The churches in the pandemics of 2020 and now 2021, the churches that are thriving, in my observation, are the ones that are leaning into the creativity of this moment. and not letting the fear and anxiousness or the peer pressure of the community of getting back into the in-person church worship and all of that, not letting that be the priority, but leaning into what things can we do new? Who would have thought that our churches, many of our churches, would figure out how to do drive-through worship? Or one church did caroling in kind of a drive-through capacity. So the churches that are thriving are the churches that are leaning into the creativity. And I would say the same for the church councils. Those that are thriving are the church councils that are leaning into the creativity and offering that kind of vision, rather than we've got 3 committees that we've got to fill and we need to figure out how to do that. That'll come, or maybe it won't, and maybe that'll be the Holy Spirit speaking to us. But either way, this is a new day, and let us lean into it from that perspective. The housekeeping very quickly. I mentioned earlier, we have a conference e-newsletter that goes out every Thursday at 2 p.m. and it has information. I provide a video. It's got all kinds of information. If you are not receiving that, it's called the e-Courier, and you would like to subscribe, just put it in the chat and we'll make sure to include you on there. The second thing is we will put the material together and we will send that to you probably by Thursday in your email, and we'll also put it in the e-Courier as well. The final thing that I want to say is each of our 3 associations have a committee on ministry, and the committee on ministry is the purpose of that is to support our churches and our ministers. Please reach out to them if you have questions, if you have needs. They want to support you and they want to support your ministers as well. As I said in my workshop, a healthy church requires a healthy pastor, and your pastor has been stretched beyond imagination and continues to be stretched. So my hope is that we can support our pastors and our associate pastors and our church staff and our churches as well. So Mary, I think you have you've gotten some water, and we are ready to move forward from there.
Yes. Ginny, do you have the closing prayer document open that I sent you? Because you actually start.
I can, yes, I can do that. So I invite us in this moment to settle ourselves, place our feet on the floor, breathing in the goodness of this day that we are not alone in ministry together, breathing out the goodness of who God has created us and needs within creation in this moment. Holy One, we pray for your church. Bring us clarity in governing and strength for ministry. Give us the courage to translate faith into action. Keep us from pure self-serving behavior and stir us to serve the needs of the church. Guide the hands and feet of your faithful people to answer all the needs that are so abundant in this world. We thank you this day for the gift of our church communities and all the people who are active in various ministries and roles, giving of their time, talent, and treasure to their congregations and to the wider church. Help them to discern the call to follow, as well as the call to lead, for both are worthy.
Lord, we worry about our world in this liminal season. So much upheaval, the twin pandemics, discord in civic life, and all this on top of daily personal struggles that we cannot pause or set aside. We ask for your presence and courage as we encounter changes in our society and in people's hearts and minds. Use us for your justice, that your kingdom may come on earth, and give us hope. Bless your church that we may understand and reach out to new people and learn new ways. Help us build a vibrant community where you speak through different voices, technologies, styles, and perspectives, and where everybody is valued and loved. We pray for our elected council leaders. Bless their lives and their service, energize their souls, enrich the outcomes of their ways of life. Grant them the desire to grow in faith and inspire others. Guide the moderators, the treasurers, the clerks, the at-large folks to know and live their roles and do their jobs well.
You call people to serve your church and inspire them to speak with authority where the powers of evil are most oppressive and human hearts yearn for dignity and compassion. Bless our pastors. Oh, bless them with the joy that you have called them to be your ministers, that they may feel and know that they are loved and supported in the best moments of ministry, and that they may know and feel that they are supported in the hardest moments when they have nothing else to give. Bless them that they may hold space for your breath to move anew among your people. Bless their families, whose home lives are uniquely impacted by their loved ones' calling. Bless the board and committee chairs, the deacons, the teachers, the pastoral relations folks. Bless the communicators, the money people, the children, the search committees. Bless the choirs who cannot sing, and the church staff who feel like every day presents another impossible challenge. Bless, oh God, the cranky people, the tired people, the new people, the frightened people. Bless the outside people, conference, national, and community partners who consult and advise and cheer on the work and ministry of congregations.
Gather us up, O Lord, and bless us as your one church, sending us into your world to serve you. Help us to do our jobs, to lead our communities, to govern effectively and minister even more effectively. Help us to be flexible. Help us to lead even though we don't know where we are going. Help us to trust you. Help us to remember that you are our God and we are your people through Jesus the Christ. Amen.
Amen. Mary, on behalf of the Missouri Mid-South Conference, we say, woohoo! Thank you very much. We are so glad that you led us. Thank you for your wisdom. And for those who are here, we will stay on. We finished early, so we'll stay till 2. If you have questions or anything like that, we'll stay on and we can talk. Otherwise, blessings to you as you begin this new year of church council ministry. Know that you are not alone and that we are with you in spirit and in love, in prayer and discernment as you minister and make a way. Have a wonderful day. Have a wonderful weekend, friends.
I'm done.
Thank you, Mary. This is wonderful. Really
Thank you,
helpful.
Jenny, for inviting me. This was fun.
Mhm.
You've got such a great group of people here.
Does anybody have any questions or anything that you want to, that we might not have talked about, that you want to ask questions or offer wisdom from your perspective?
I think this is something that we might consider on maybe a smaller scale within the individual associations, or rather than a very large group like this, plan something on a smaller scale within all of them periodically through the year.
I certainly support that. This was the first time that we have done this in my tenure here, and didn't know how many or what this would look like. And, I appreciated that so many people and so many churches, I think there were about 30 churches that were represented. And so I think that's a great idea, Dennis. The more resources that we can provide from the association and conference, the better. Yes, Rita.
Yeah, I think it was great. I want it to continue in any form, conference, association. I know in the past, before you were here, we occasionally used to do this at least as an association and have church council leadership come together and share things. It's invaluable. So thank you very much for reinstituting it now.
Mhm. And what I love about Zoom is that, we can, it can be so many of us in different settings. So
Yes, this is one of the formats. Zoom has been wonderful for these types of things. And I think that several of us have been talking about doing something like this. And I know when we did specialized ones for maybe treasurers or whatever, separate groups, it didn't work quite as well. But today there were a lot of options to choose from. And I think that, I hope it met the needs of others. It certainly did me.
Jenny, I was thinking at one point today about search and call stewards and the model that we use there, and wondering if we shouldn't maybe develop church council stewards or church moderator stewards, or a group of people who are experienced, that might be a pool of resources available to all churches across the conference, something like that.
I'm very open to that. A part of what my goal is collecting names and contact information, so that my hope is that we could do an email to the church council moderators, and offer that support and resource kind of best practices sharing and things like that. That was a part of my goal for today, was really to hopefully get more information of who is serving on our church council, so that we can support them. But I love the idea of a church council kind of steward or moderators or something like that.
I like the idea of maybe doing some brainstorming on post-pandemic church again.
Yes.
Because I think we all will need to continue in new ways, and we can learn from each other on that.
I think that certainly is a great possibility for our conference annual gathering this year, because it's virtual. we're going to do the business meeting on one day, but then we're going to intersperse in the weeks before kind of workshop opportunities like this to give. So I can imagine that that might be one of those opportunities. Yes, Laura.
I think maybe somebody on the phone wants to speak. Okay, I'll speak. I just want to thank you again for doing this. I think this is so beneficial. And one of the probably intended things, which you wouldn't think could happen through Zoom, is the relationship building. I know when I sat in on the COVID calls earlier in the pandemic, it was so helpful to know other names that were facing similar things that I could talk to. And even today, I was thinking about different people that I need to call about questions like, okay, how are you handling your church attendance? And how are you handling church membership? Whether they're an active member, or do you have different classifications of membership, which is an aside I don't like at all. But it's nice to be able to talk with others and find out how they're doing things. It doesn't mean you have to do it that way, but it gives you some options. And these type of events, even though we may not have gotten into that really in depth, it's still, you put a name and a face together, and you may hear a note or a nugget that seems familiar, and gives you an opportunity to launch that conversation. So I want to thank you for that. I didn't sit in on the finance one, but that is something that I agree really needs to be done, especially since I just found out that our acknowledgement of gifts is, only really done, even our memorial fund. Our memorial fund doesn't send an acknowledgement with a dollar amount on it. And I was telling them, no, the IRS says if it's more than $250, you have to do that. Well, they didn't know that. So, and I can't believe we're the only church that has those kind of issues. So if we can sort of crowdsource some of these issues, I suggested maybe a listserv, or as you pointed out, a monthly meeting. I think it'd be worth people's time. Around the horizon, what's coming at you and you may not have thought of too.
And Laura, I really appreciate what you put in the chat at different times, related to your knowledge of bylaws and board resources and things like that. I think that's really important as well. Yeah.
And I have to give credit. I started learning all that stuff 30 years ago, being involved with the conference and the church. So that's where
that's great.
Kind of back, but that's where people who haven't had that opportunity need to know they don't have to do this alone. There's a lot of resources out there, including, I want to lift this up, and I didn't put this in the chat, but for those of you who are still on here, go to the insurance board's website. They have a whole bunch of things. There's a document I found in there, which right now we don't need to worry about as much, but it's called The Power of Hello. And it's recognizing when an unfamiliar face comes into your church, how the power of hello is welcoming, but also gives you an opportunity in this day and time of how to assess a situation, how that should be done in a non-threatening manner. Well, no, it was there, but it's on the insurance board website. So I think it's a great resource.
Wow. That's great. That's helpful. I'll go and look at that. And we try to put those in the e-courier, but not overwhelm the e-courier as well. So. Okay, friends. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your time and your commitment. And Mary, thank you. And hope that y'all have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Here we go.